Welcome to our annual 360 StratCom event. My name is Graham Brookie, and I'm the Senior Director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council.
And I'm Rose Jackson, Director of the DFRLab's Democracy and Tech Initiative. We're thrilled to be back here this year for an exciting day of programming focused on how governments are working to drive forward a proactively democratic tech agenda.
When we gathered here for StratCom last December, DFRLab was starting to document Russia's military buildup around Ukraine, which was happening in broad daylight and verifiable using sources open to all who were watching. Now, we're 10 months into an active war of aggression perpetrated by Russia on European soil. It's a kinetic war in which digital ecosystems and tech policy are a theater of the conflict in ways that will set precedent for years to come, both in war and in peace.
Since last year, we've seen democracies seem to come to a more serious and proactive appreciation of the systemic nature of the internet and the rising stakes for the future of it around the world.
Democracies have re-engaged the multinational and multi-stakeholder bodies of their own making and reinvigorated diplomatic engagement on everything from semiconductors and supply chains to data flows and transparency standards.
While that all may sound kind of semantic, here's why it matters. The internet is systemic. Even as we talk about digital sovereignty and dueling internets, the fact is that the underlying technology our digital world is built on is connective. And the information ecosystem that sits on top of that is inherently referential and linked together. In fact, it's global.
Countries with strong viewpoints on how digital ecosystems should be funded, built, and governed already have an outsized impact on our day-to-day lives, which will only continue to grow.
Now, whether you care about that because it means there's a market to compete in, or because you want to ensure that all people have the right and capacity to express their viewpoints, you have an interest in democracies leveraging their collective power in the ITU.
Which stands for the International Telecommunications Union.
The IGF.
The Internet Governance Forum.
The UN.
Of course, the United Nations.
The G7.
The Group of 7.
Okay, the G20.
Seeing a trend here, the Group of 20.
Okay, and an unending number of acronyms that we created to ensure that the internet is governed collectively by industry, civil society, and countries.
And if that's not enough of an argument for you to tune in today, know that authoritarian countries are clear-eyed about the opportunities this digital ecosystem provides to extend and project their interests and power on the world stage.
DFRLab's resident fellow for China, Kenton Thibault, recently released a fascinating report on how the CCP talks about its worldview and intentions in the digital space. What stood out for me was that China's leading scholars assessed that the US and its allies owed much of their power and success to the global world order built on the concept of universal human rights. The CCP believed that it was a powerful strategy that, try though they might, was pretty hard to break.
And so China set out to find topical and regional areas where they might build their own version of universal and interlocking global strategy. What they landed on was that the West was asleep on technology and vulnerable in the developing world, especially the global majority or global South.
So they spent the last decade actively participating in governing and standard-setting bodies, driving mutually reinforcing industrial and commercial strategies, and spending real time focused on narrative and the information environment, targeting the majority world specifically. This all while building a surveillance state at home dependent on technological advances spurred by its engagement with the world.
Meanwhile, the democratic world has been slow to build a cohesive approach with recognition of what exactly is at stake. And now some argue the US in particular should just accept an end to an open internet. The democratic world's response to the authoritarian approach, which explicitly is designed to build an alternative world order at odds with universal rights, cannot be to abandon what even China has assessed to be the strength of that rights-based system.
This is good news. We have the tools and capacity as a community of small d Democrats the world over to bring our digital world into a more truly inclusive version of our universal aspirations. And at the same time, we'd be wrong to overstate the success of the authoritarian approach. They're facing challenges too, spurred in part by the reminder of just how universal the values and aspirations we're talking about are.
For example, over the last 2 weeks in China, we've seen historic protests in response to a zero-COVID policy underpinned by massive state surveillance systems and information suppression.
Or in Iran, the response to the death of a young woman named Masha Amini at the hands of state security services inspiring mass protest. Iran's response to quell the unrest has been deadly, but its efforts to silence domestic and international voices online hasn't worked.
And in the meantime, democracies are slowly retaking the spaces through which the digital world is shaped. At the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, one of the most important standard-setting bodies for the internet, democracies rallied around the candidacy of Doreen Bogdan-Martin, a respected expert with a long track record fighting for internet access for all, who now leads the organization.
The European Union passed what amounts to the most consequential rewriting of the rules of the internet in a generation, setting a precedent for democratically aligned tech governance with the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act.
Countries are leveraging efforts like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council to drive real outcomes while pushing forward important domestic pieces of the puzzle, whether that's the US CHIPS Act, the US Inflation Reduction Act, or the EU's Green New Deal.
Simultaneously, governments got organized, creating new offices and teams capable of driving coordinated action on all these fronts, whether that's the US's new Cyberspace and Digital Policy Bureau at the State Department, or the growing number of global tech ambassadors, including a new one from the EU who we'll hear from today.
Listen, these developments really matter, but there is so much more for democracies to do in driving forward a more rights-respecting and prosperous future.
Today's program teases some of these themes out, looking specifically at how the US and the EU are approaching the task. You're going to hear today about the recent lockdown protests in China.
We're chatting with the drafters of the European Union's landmark Digital Services and Digital Markets Acts.
We've got a big section on a decade-old democratic tech alliance, the Freedom Online Coalition. We're honored to be joined by the Canadian Deputy Foreign Minister and the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor to introduce that conversation, and a stellar civil society panel digging into what the body is and how it can live up to its promise.
And finally, we've got the first Deputy National Cyber Director, Camille Stewart-Gloucester, here to talk about their new office and what it means to have an inclusive and capable workforce in and out of government.
Now, we've already mentioned one of our major reports from this year about China, but we wanted to also encourage you to look around the StratCom website for some of our other pieces. This includes one we're publishing today that provides an introduction to the Freedom Online Coalition, laying out its history, its structure, and operations for those newer to it.
You can find these, along with all the other research and investigations the DFRLab has done this year, on the Digital Forensic Research Lab section of the Atlantic Council's website or on our Medium page. We're very, very online.
Before we get started, since we're so online, we hope that you'll tune in throughout the day. And as a reminder, you can find the full agenda on the 360 StratCom website, which I assume you're watching right now.
You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn for updates through our handle @DFRLab. And we really hope that you'll add to the conversation, post questions, and send your thoughts across all of those platforms using the hashtag 360StratCom, and tagging us at the DFRLab, of course.
Now let's get down to business. First up for this year's StratCom is a conversation on the recent lockdown protests that spread across China in the last few weeks. To help us make sense of these events and how information flows within and around China, we've got a stellar panel for you.
I'm pleased to pass this off to our own Kenton Thibault, DFRLab's resident fellow for China and expert on the CCP's approach to the digital world, who will get us started. Over to you, Kenton.
Last weekend, large protests sprang up in cities across China. The protests seemed sparked by the news that a fire in a residential building in Xinjiang had killed at least 10 people, who were purportedly unable to escape the blaze due to the region's strict lockdowns. People took to the streets to protest in cities across the country and in almost 80 universities in China, organizing despite the government's heavy control over social media and the internet. Protesters sang the Internationale and China's national anthem while demanding an end to China's zero COVID policy. Some protesters demanded that China's Communist Party and President Xi Jinping step down. Some university protesters also called for universal rights, while others held up blank sheets of paper, which symbolized their lack of freedom of expression. News that protesters are being identified and detained via China's surveillance mechanisms has come out as the state weighs how seriously to crack down on dissent and is rolling out adjustments to its COVID policies. So, what are we to make of these protests? Why should we care about what happens inside of China? And what, if anything, does it mean for discussions of technology and democracy? I'm joined here by three experts who will hopefully be able to shed some light on these questions and help us know what to make of all of this. So first, we have Maya Wong, the Associate Director for the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. Next is Dr. Sheena Greitens, an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directs UT's Asia Policy program. Last, but certainly not least, is Xiao Qiang, a research scientist at Berkeley School of Information and the founder and editor-in-chief of China Digital Times, a bilingual China news website. A note, I'll be directing questions to the panelists, but invite them to jump in at any time to add on or respond to the points others have raised. So first, Maya, I'd like to start with you and your view of how we should be looking at these protests. Your original research on China's use of technology for mass surveillance helped to galvanize international attention on these developments in China and globally. So can you give us a lay of the land of what's going on, what are the nature of these protests, and how we should be looking at this?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm honored to be here today. What you described at the beginning of our session is a very good overview of what's been going on in China. Is that after 3 years of very strict COVID controls, some of which are, so draconian that has led to deaths because people lack medical care and, basic necessities, people in China have had enough. And that kind of bottled up energy after these 3 years essentially exploded after not just the fire in Urumqi, but also because of a series of other tragedies like a bus carrying people off to forceful quarantine had essentially had an accident and killed those some of those on board. There has been another, a single person protest in Beijing that grabbed widespread attention. And that protester had a banner that essentially linked the COVID controls to Xi Jinping's repressive rule. These events kind of lay the groundwork. At the time when it happened, people were very outraged, or people were very interested in the protest, the Longman protest. But they didn't, it led to protests at the time, but they kind of bottled up. And when the fire happened in Urumqi, and after people have had 3 years of lockdown, every urbanite in China's worst fear for the last 3 years, when they are locked down at home, where their doors are shut from outside by authorities with metal chains and iron rods and whatnot. Every urbanite in China have had that fear of dying in fire. It doesn't matter. You could be a lawyer, you could be earning a lot of money, you could be anyone, and you could be suffering the same fate. So I would say that Urumqi fire really touched a nerve in a very in a way that everybody could understand. And that led to the current wave of protest. Unfortunately, the protests, although they concerned the fire victims in Urumqi, and there has been a lot of expression of solidarity with those victims, they are not about people in China showing solidarity with the Uyghurs regarding crimes against humanity, targeting Uyghurs. So I think that has to be made clear as we discuss these protests.
Yes, thank you so much, Maya. And on the note of Xinjiang, Sheena, I'd like to turn to you. So the recent round of protests, as we've said, was galvanized by this news of a fire at a residential building in Urumqi. Can you speak a bit to why maybe Xinjiang was the catalyst for this round of protests? And maybe a bit broader, since you've written so much on this, how, if at all, does this fit in with our understanding of the role that Xinjiang plays in China's security state?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. So let me take the second question first, and then come back to this point about the role of Xinjiang specifically. First, I think this was a really interesting moment if you're looking at it from the eyes of the party state. Really interesting test of the security apparatus that Xi Jinping has now spent his first 2 terms trying to build. National security, which is really, when Xi Jinping talks about it, regime security and the security of the party leadership. Has been a huge priority for Xi Jinping over the course of the past 10 years. And we saw that really elevated and codified in the text of the 20th Party Congress work report. So then it's really interesting after that, almost immediately, to see sort of multiple Well, let me go back actually and say that that whole model of social control and regime security is aimed at what Xi Jinping calls prevention and control, which is a buzzword that's been applied both to the management of potential social unrest and to the zero COVID policies that China's adopted since 2020. And so the idea of that is to be hyper preventive and to really prevent dissent and protest and collective action from emerging at all. So it was really interesting and I imagine troubling from the standpoint of China's leaders to see that model fail initially at multiple places, multiple cities in China when these protests broke out. So if I was Xi Jinping and I was looking at his own extraordinarily sort of draconian standards for prevention and control of dissent and of social unrest, I'm not sure I would be pleased with the performance of the security state that Xi Jinping has built. So I think that there's going to be some interesting questions on how the party state and China's own internal security officials reflect on their performance and what they do. Now, I don't think that means that the system overall has failed. The capabilities they've built are still very useful for interrupting protests that are continuing and frankly being retributive or punishing people who participated or were standing behind megaphones in the last week or two. So I don't want to sort of sound like I think the system completely failed, but if I was looking at it from the standpoint of the kind of performance that Xi Jinping has signaled and communicated that he expects, I'm not sure that I would be satisfied with the security apparatus's performance this week. The reason that Xinjiang matters in that is that Xinjiang has been a sort of test case and really high priority for Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept. One of the goals of the sort of security approach that Xi Jinping has taken is to prevent protest and grievance and mobilization from connecting or spreading across locations, across classes or sectors of society within China and among the Chinese people, and also across ethnicities. And the party state has spent a lot of time framing Xinjiang and framing Uyghur dissent and dissatisfaction as a violent threat to the safety of the rest of the Chinese population, particularly the 90% Han majority. And so, and that's intended to sort of atomize and prevent cross-communal and cross-ethnic solidarity and collective action. And so what was particularly interesting and striking, but probably also concerning to China's leadership and to its policing and sort of repressive apparatus is exactly that we've seen so many expressions of solidarity. Zero COVID has given people a point of commonality in opposition to the party state. And we've seen things like citizens in Shanghai and elsewhere in Eastern China saying, we are all Xinjiang people. And so that it's both sort of ironic and fitting that a place that has been the heart of some of the most intense, most horrific repression by the party state is also sort of the catalyst for this now, nationwide pushback. And that seems both ironic because it is the thing the party state has worked really hard to prevent, but there also seems to be some sort of in some senses, it seems very fitting and appropriate that Xinjiang should be, and that this particular tragedy actually would get people's attention and would create that kind of solidarity across the country that we haven't seen much of with the measures that have been targeted specifically at the Uyghur population before. So it is a really interesting development, and I think there's probably a lot still there to watch. And it'll be fascinating to see if that dynamic in particular continues.
Great, thank you so much. And speaking of, these mechanisms of prevention and control, I'd like to turn to Xiaoqiang. You founded China Digital Times to focus on news items which are blocked, deleted, or suppressed by China's state censors. What are some of the trends you're seeing coming out of the protests? And kind of speaking to what Sheena was talking about this kind of inter-ethnic solidarity, are these protests different in any substantial way than those that we see kind of appearing periodically in China? And then kind of a follow-up question to this is, how do protesters get information out, see information, and organize under these repressive conditions?
Well, first of all, let me say that this round of protests started from one man about a little bit more than 1 month ago. Maya mentioned it before, the lone protester, or you call him Bridge Man. We actually know his name. His name is Peng Lifa. He's a self-made scientist. Put a large banners in the middle of the day in Beijing, and right before Xi Jinping officially basically crowning himself as a lifelong leader, but extending his third term, unprecedented third term as a party congress, right days before, with the banner, if everybody remembers, says following, right? We want the food, no PCR test, freedom, not lockdowns, dignity, not lies, reform, not cultural revolution, elections, not rulers, to be citizens, not slaves, and with a large banner saying, remove the dictator Xi Jinping. 1 month later, these slogans are actually being shouted out throughout China in those crowds. That is really remarkable, that when some crowds, like protesters in Chengdu or in some campus, when they shout, we don't want PCR tests, we want freedom. When the people in Beijing saying, we don't want an emperor, we want a democracy, they are all anchoring his voice, who's spoken for everyone. The dictator himself is the biggest uniter of this whole movement, nationwide movement. Answer your second question. It is so significant. It's so different than any previous ones in the last 30-some years, because this time it's not just anti-zero COVID. It's anti-censorship, because people criticizing, people voicing, people put their miseries, sharing, it's all being deleted and censored on Chinese social media. You cannot say anything that people have to go on the street. All you need to do is holding on a blank sheet of paper that already said everything. And then it's anti-Xi directly. Xi made the zero COVID policy is his signature policy. He's so wedded into this. He thought that's his legitimacy, his biggest achievement until a year ago. Now his biggest disaster. And no, don't forget this. The Chinese people actually do not want another lifelong emperor. The Chinese Communist Party doesn't really want it. Xi imposed this thing on everybody through his two terms, intensify the crackdown, surveillance everyone, including the party officials, creating those apparatus. And no matter how preemptive it is, by this point, through the misery of the injury he done to the people's lives throughout the country, that generated this nationwide sentiment finally erupt. Let me answer your final question. What's the information control and the Great Firewall and all the censorship machines played here? First of all, the domestic censorship mechanism are being overwhelmed by those protesters' messages, particularly videos. Remember, China has more than 1 billion smartphones. Everybody has one. That's their electronic shackle, as a matter of fact. As a surveillance machine, everybody carries it, and the state directly have access to their personal information and where they are about, and through this QR code called health code. It's in such a totalitarian sort of under that mechanism. But when you overcome that fear, particularly the young generation, then the cell phone, smartphone become their weapon. If you notice those protesters' images, everyone holding up their smartphone as a weapon, taking pictures and videos to the police and spreading those ones, immediately overwhelm the domestic censorship mechanism. Well, the mechanism is still working, wiping them out, but the Great Firewall has a significant hole, have significant leak. There's on a daily basis at least multi-million people using different kind of VPNs and circumvention tools that are using Telegraph, for example, and those videos in the real time being deposited into the Telegraphs and being transmitted to Twitter, to social media outside of China, such as YouTube, and even one single Twitter who is totally amateur, a Chinese 30 years old living in Italy, get those videos, all these videos, and he's like so fast to republishing them, repost on the Twitter, and then the people were moving those videos immediately back to China, so the people in the city almost on a real time knows where the protesters are. So even the Chinese state media never report anything. Even the international media can only cover Beijing and Shanghai. But across China, across 80 campuses, across multiple big cities, those videos and messages are almost in real time spread out, both through in and out of the Great Firewall and to sort of overwhelming the censorship machine temporarily spread out the whole country. And that's how the movement started. The Xi Jinping, the censorship machine, and the Great Firewall, at least during that couple of days, didn't do the job they're supposed to do. Okay, or let me put it this way: Xi Jinping is an incompetent dictator, including his repression machine, and that's simply is a fact. I just want to end up to say, the anti-COVID protest, the zero COVID protest, the anti-censorship, and anti-Xi to be the lifelong leader is the same message throughout this protest. The political message cannot be separated from this anti-zero COVID reaction. And Xi heard that. That's why you see this immediate relax of the COVID, but same time, of course, he will repress all the demonstrations and political dissent. But let's see how far he can hold on this.
Yes, and speaking of, how zero COVID was kind of the galvanizer that, allowed this kind of wave of protests to happen. Maya, I'll direct this question to you, but would welcome, all of the panelists to opine on this. Where do the protests go from here? Will most of the public anger be diffused with these, adjustments to the COVID policy that we're seeing come out of China now? And what will happen to the organizers of the protests? And do we think these modest adjustments are, temporary? How do we think China's going to respond when, the death rates start to rise as lockdown lifts? So Maya, I'm directing that at you, but would welcome our other panelists to give their opinions on this as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for this question, because I really want to push back on the very question itself. Is that I think often, especially I think in the West, every time we see protests in places like Iran or in China, or any number of protests in the last couple of years, there have been many. The question is often like, after the protests essentially kind of wind down, and people kind of basically ask, is that it? is that all there is? Or is the status quo essentially prevails? Is all what the government has to do is these minor adjustments and people would be essentially appeased? I think that's a wrong question, because even in the West, you go out to protest about, the climate or women's rights, things don't change overnight. And why would we expect that in the most authoritarian of governments like China, they have spent decades in building is, social control machinery, that the regime would somehow just like crumble from that? I think that underestimates, the power of these governments, and it kind of asks an unfair question of these movements. Now, I think Xiaotian have set the stage very well, is that these movements are essentially, call and responses through time and through space, right? Xiaotian himself was became an activist after 1989, the authorities, Tiananmen massacre back then, and has, set up, China Digital Times, which have continued to play a very central role today, reporting information on China, and essentially people in China also read the CDT and get, inspired and learned. So to ask whether or not these protests are going to fizzle out is to miss kind of the essential historical arc of China or any authoritarian governments. China has had difficulties after the fall of the Qing dynasty 100 years ago. And at the time, people, intellectuals, ordinary people were fighting for essentially the same things, democracy and freedoms, and grappling with how to reconcile China's, deep traditions of various different kinds with modernity. And I think that struggle continues. Now, the protests are important this time because they give people hope that they're not alone. For the last 10 years or so since Xi Jinping came to power in particular, I think people have felt incredibly lonely if they support human rights or democracy. It gives people a sense of solidarity among themselves, between groups. I think both Sheena and Xiaoqiang have discussed that. Solidarity that often is intentionally fraught by the party state. It allows people to practice decision-making in a group. That is not very difficult that is very difficult if you have never actually done kind of democratic decision-making before. So these are, episodes of hope in China that will echo from now to, later. We see during the protest, one of the protesters were asked, why was he there? And he said, because it's my duty, which is a beautiful echo to, of course, one of those famous clips from 1989 when the protester was also asked why he was going to Tiananmen Square, and he also said it was his duty. So I think that it is important to look at China with a longer frame. And to understand that, is a difficult battle that people are definitely fighting. As to what will happen to the organizers of the protest, I think that's a very interesting question. And I think that so far the reporting, of course, there have been arrests, there have been interrogations, there have been phone tracking of people in different cities, suggesting that the authorities will clamp down on, kind of essentially punish people for going to the protest. But what I find actually even more interesting is actually, I think we haven't seen the worst of it yet, because we know how brutal the Chinese government can be, or that there is some kind of in the back, some kind of discussion or perhaps paralysis of some form among the governments about what to do. So now I think both Sheena and Xiaoqiang have essentially said that I think the surveillance state have somehow failed. I wonder whether or not kind of the decision-making hierarchy or the processes within the Chinese government essentially kind of did it actually fail in kind of preventing or in punishing the protesters going forward, or was that somewhat of a success? Because in some ways, they have now, as far as we can see right now, a relatively lighter touch. They have responded to the protesters' demand. They have not rode the tanks in like they did in 1989. So in some ways, things may have, evolved compared to them. Was it the result of these decades of practice cracking down on protests big and small? I think that all remains to be seen. Of course, that doesn't take away the fact that protesters themselves are scared, and that I think the effect of intimidation is very much there. I do wonder just what is going on behind the scene among government officials in discussions of what is their lesson learned with handling the protests.
Yeah, and Sheena and Xiaoqiang, do you have any responses to the points that Maya raised?
Sheena, why did you say that?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to jump in, although I'm broadly in agreement with a lot of the points that Maya has raised. I think there's kind of an interesting question here about what you use as a standard for success, and in some ways that's the wrong question, I think, to ask about what's going on with these protests. I think my own read of this is that Maya's right. The state has used a relatively lighter hand. In part, I think, though, that's because it knows that it has the capability to identify these people and deal with them in a much more targeted way behind the scenes later or in between these evening vigils and protests. And we've already seen some evidence of that happening. So I think we have to remember, when we look at public protest and we look at the behavior of the security forces at public protest, that there's a great deal of repressive work or of the party state managing social unrest and potential instability that occurs in places that are invisible to us and that we can't see. And in some ways, the project that Xi Jinping has embarked on in the last 10 years is actually to try to shift much more of the party state's work of social control to those individualized, targeted, private spaces that we can't see, and out of the kind of public sphere and the protest areas that we've seen in the past week. So again, I agree with Maya. I don't think this is probably considered a resounding success for local public security bureaus and internal security officials. But I also think that the state, the state has and then the local security forces have a lot of capabilities that they can bring to bear. And although we see the people protesting, showing incredible courage and really doing things, I agree with Xiaochang that these are different. There are many qualities of this wave of protests that are different and important. But I think we have to remember that what we see taking place in public and at these protests is only one piece of the story, and maybe not the most important part of the party state's response. That said, even if the state maintains control, it's possible that what will happen is that dissatisfaction remains, or that, the party state has fixed this specific policy, but the realization that citizens seem to have expressed of the arbitrariness of state authority, of the fact that the state can put you at risk by confining you to your home, may extend beyond zero COVID. That's, we've certainly seen people articulate in the protest that there's something more fundamental at issue that they're concerned about here. And so it's possible that even if the party state successfully makes this tactical adjustment on zero COVID and people go home, that the sort of distrust of the party state and the party state saying, look, we're doing this for you, right? Zero COVID this is our way of keeping China safe. If you fundamentally undermine trust in that narrative, then those effects may linger below the surface for a long time, even if they don't manifest as more protest and public dissent for some time to come. So I think I again broadly agree with so much of what Maya had said. I just wanted to flag for folks who are listening that there's a good portion of this story that is going to play out and probably is already playing out in places and political spaces in China that we can't see, and that is in fact a very deliberate part of the party state strategy for managing these issues.
Thank you, Sheena.
I agree. I'll use the word cold revenge. That's what the party going to take. Not so visible, but they will go after everyone that they have a capacity. But I also want to point out something we haven't touched upon, which is come me a big surprise. Not actually the demonstration in Beijing and Shanghai and Chengdu and Zhengzhou, but across 80 university campuses, the young generation. People don't know China enough, familiar to know how tight the university campus students under the restriction, under control, political control after the '89. They're almost impossible for the young people, the students, to organize themselves again. Much, even in a minor case reasons, much less for political one. But this young generation are different. Even their parents have barely no memories of 1989. They grow up in a relatively, rich China and economically a lot of prosperities, and they had hope China is more and more open to the world until in the last 10 years, particularly the last 3 years. Let's not forget that. Not only these students were confined in an apartment, lost their college life for 3 years straight, not only because that they have a very dark prospect for the employment because of Chinese down economy of them, they also really, really see Xi Jinping is taking China to the wrong direction. And if he wants to be a lifelong leader, that means in the next 10, 20, 30 years, they don't have the future because Xi Jinping taking China to the opposite direction that they would like to be. This last sort of hope is the final touch that they have to up against him. It's the political one. It's not even just about, I want to get out of my apartment and I want to go to the party and I want my life back, or even I want employment. They target on this one person, rightly so, because unlike the previous Chinese leaders of Hu Jintao or even Deng Xiaoping starts, they are in general, even it's a repressive country, it's a Communist Party dictatorship, but it's bringing China generally more open to seemingly a right direction until Xi Jinping last 10 years, until particularly the COVID last 3 years. If we said what's been blown away, the trust, it's a big lie of Xi Jinping just put himself as a leader of people. Yeah, well, people now to say, no, right? You are not doing that for the people. You are making people suffering. You don't even care about the economy. You don't even care about how the world look at China. All you care is about preserving your power lifelong. And people see that through, finally, they expressed it. So what I call is a breach of the big silence. That's transformed people's consciousness. Even on the surface, that will be quiet. The party has enough, Xi Jinping has enough resources to allocate, to suppress. But this change of consciousness is also fundamentally changed some kind of a relationship in a very psychological way between Xi Jinping and the people he rules. It's not just people afraid of Xi Jinping. Now Xi Jinping has to afraid of the population that he's going to rule in the next indefinite time. And this is why China is different than a few weeks ago.
Got it. And thank you all so much for your perspectives. I want to ask one more question about the nature of the protests, and then I'm going to pivot a little bit to us talking about more of the China and the world perspective, or how we should kind of think about what's going on in China in an international perspective. So Maya, I'm going to direct this question at you. Some observers have pointed out that many of the organizers and leaders of the protests were young women, and this is kind of speaking to a little bit more of the fundamental issues at play that we've been kind of talking about, characterizing the protests. And in our own studies of Chinese social media, some of the most heavily censored topics, as much, if not more so even than COVID-related topics, includes news of violence against women and gender disparities. So are there some gender dynamics to this public activism that we need to understand?
Absolutely. I mean, in China, as in many other parts of the world, we did see generally empowerment, especially in the form of education, but in China too, is also access to employment in the last decades. Women become more vocal in activist circles over time. But at the same time, in recent years, also in China and around the world, we see whether it is in countries which saw democratic backsliding or deepening authoritarianism, that women are essentially kind of like people who are LGBT individuals, kind of considered as a symptom of whether or not you're talking about kind of modernity or kind of Western influences. Their vocalness and their equality are a problem in these countries, considered by these government officials, are problems that need to be essentially stuffed back into their places. Now, it's really hard once people have gained that power to kind of take away that power. We see that in the US as well. And so women around the world really have played essential roles in organizing, protest organizing to push back against erosion of their rights everywhere. And I think that is a force to be reckoned with. Now, Xi Jinping, since he came to power in 2013, actually did target feminist movement in China as he narrowed or cracked down on civil society. Very early on, a group of young women known as Feminist Five were arrested and I think briefly detained for several months. And that was big news, also because women, they were university students or graduates, and they were organizing these increasingly visible protests focused on women's rights, particularly domestic violence. So that was 10 years ago. And I think that laid the groundwork for women later on who made up the bulk of these protests today, as a matter of their mentality has changed. Their minds have been transformed by these ideas laid by their forebears before them. And you can't really undo them. And in a way, I think Xiaotian is also right in saying that if your young people are rising up and their minds have been opened to different possibilities, so different ways of framing the world, it's really hard to kind of stuff them back. And so, I mean, of course, the party had done that in the past. But in the past, again, I think in 1989, there was the promise of economic takeoff. There was like the promise that if you don't do this, we'll give you something else. I think this promise is not quite the same now with the economy essentially slowing down. So I would say that the impact of, women will continue to play a great role in China's democratic movement, I guess. But, to say that is not to say that this is anything really new, because to me, having seen several different movements in the world, I often think women are the unsung heroes who actually organize, who actually make the flyers, who actually make sure people turn up and maintain order in these protests. So the presence of women and the participation is really often the central muscle that keeps these movements going in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Maya. And you provide a nice powerful segue to the next portion of our questions, which will focus more on kind of the internal-external relationship. So Sheena, I'd like to direct this question to you. You've published a lot of field-leading work on how China thinks about its internal security, for example, how it views social stability and political unrest, and its influence abroad. So can you explain this relationship for us and, in your view, what the dynamics are with that?
Yeah, so again, I think this event or set of events has the potential to have some really interesting long-term impact on how China is viewed as a sort of global supplier of a very particular type of security. And what I mean by that is that China has, over the course of the past 5-ish years, really increased its provision of both surveillance technology, but also has started to offer police training. Sometimes coupled with the provision of surveillance technology for policing purposes, but sometimes just offering to train police officers. And if you look at sort of some of the internal discourse of the public security officials and the political legal apparatus, there have been discussions about adopting a global vision for national or for state security work. There have been discussions about sharing the experience of building a safe China and offering it as a model to countries who are interested, not necessarily imposing the model by force, but certainly offering and sharing lessons, capability, and tools. And that's both the technology, the actual surveillance technology piece of it, but also increasingly the offer to train police officials. So we've seen things like the Lianyungang Forum. We've seen things like the offer that Xi Jinping made under the auspices of the Global Security Initiative over the summer to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to train 20,000 police officers. And so we are increasingly seeing that China is at least offering these tools and these lessons to the world. And the sort of message is, if there's domestic instability, if there's high crime, if these are non-traditional security threats in Xi Jinping's comprehensive national security concept, and the idea or the pitch is China can make these things safer, can create stability. We're in an unstable world, Right? And there's obviously, an attempt to present these in as benign and sort of constructive a way as possible as governance rather than repression. But what's really interesting about that, we don't always have a good sense of how successful that pitch has been. Sometimes it's been temporarily effective, and then the technology hasn't worked as well as it's been promised. And so there have been questions raised about the efficacy of Chinese surveillance exports for actual public safety in the global in various parts of the global South. But what's interesting is that China's ability to sort of sell this solution or this set of solutions, whether that's police training, Chinese style training of police with Chinese characteristics, or it's the export of Chinese surveillance technology for public security, really depend on sort of the demonstration of efficacy in domestic politics in China. Right, that's where China can point to as a proof of concept and say, look, these technologies or this training works. Look what we've been able to do. China is so safe. We can teach you how to manage domestic instability. Remember that often there, the governments that they're offering these trainings and capabilities to are either not democratic or sort of weak democracies with, uneven governance capabilities. And so I think there's an interesting question here about how the protests and the world's view of the protests will affect China's current trajectory and its current efforts to market itself as a supplier of that type of global security capability. My read is that China is really trying to position itself as a security partner of choice to particular countries, but it's doing so by offering internal security capabilities, which the United States has often been pretty nervous about offering or assisting with, in part because of valid democracy concerns over the impact on democracy, freedom, and human rights. And so China is sort of, move to be a global security supplier in that particular space has been notable to me over the course of the past 5 years. But the protests and how successful China is at constraining and managing the protests without high costs and lots of ugly visible repression will not only have an impact on the domestic dynamics, but I think also on China's reputation as a supplier of global security. And so I think that's very much something to watch in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, fascinating. And Xiaochang, in your view, what changes do you think we'll see in this kind of the next phase of Chinese internet censorship, and in this context of globally rising digital authoritarianism?
Well, I agree a lot of what just Sheena said, and I think another panelist, Maya, have done excellent work to expose the China surveillance apparatus and also its global expansion. But coming to the internet censorship itself, yes, I did say that they temporarily being overwhelmed and breached. But yes, it can be restored, and it'll be up to the high gear because I was trying to say, Xi Jinping now is being scared. He is an insecure one. He's an unwelcome emperor of China. Not only unwelcome by its people, but it's also unwelcome almost by his party. So he can only rely on the brutal repression. He's also a brutal one. And don't forget, he's a powerful one. China, after all, the GDP is about the same size or a little bit less at the same scale of the United States. But that wealth, giving that totalitarian regime, it can be easily used and allocated to any repressive machines or buy people off, or Xi Jinping have so much resources can use. Even he failed his economic policy, he failed his international relations, he failed even this zero COVID. He need to deliver something to Chinese people to shift this attention. That I'm afraid he's also a dangerous dictator. That shift of attention could be pointing to Taiwan. That would be easily can be imagined to galvanize the nationalism, to gain the loyalty of his party, and that will be something when he's desperate, and that'll make China's relationship with the world immediately drastically different. even in the short term. I'm not even speaking about a long term. Short term meaning, in the coming years, or maybe 5-10 years. I'm afraid that we have to pay a great attention on any development on this front.
Great, absolutely. And as this is a forum that brings together governments and civil society stakeholders to think about, the future of democracy, of the internet, of democratically aligned technologies. And I'd open this up to all the panelists. What, in your view, is something that you would want the audience here watching at StratCom to take away from our discussion? What is kind of a key takeaway in your view in this discussion that would be useful for the audience to kind of come away with?
I can start. I think it is to always remember, and I think this get lost along the way in the last 20 years, is how many people in China want and desire democracy and human rights, and not to lose sight of them and to speak to them. I think why I'm saying this got lost is because I think the last 20 years, we see a lot more kind of Western leaders essentially kind of perhaps feeling that the nationalistic aspects of the Chinese population. And I'm not saying that nationalism and a desire for democracy can't actually overlap. But I do think that when Western governments are formulating policies in recent years, they tend to forget that people in China are also in a contentious environment. They are also kind of debating or have different views on these issues. So I think keeping them in mind in formulating policies, and it's hard to elaborate on how that would be done in this short time frame, but keeping them in mind would be an important takeaway for this session. Another thing I really want to say is that I don't know how the rest of your day is going to shake out, but I think there's often this perception or this argument that is essentially the West or democracies versus authoritarianism when it comes to digital rights. Now, I and my colleagues in Human Rights Watch who work on technology have really tried to push back against this kind of binary narrative, because what is really happening is the fact that I think both, particularly the US, but also other governments or other forms of technologies originating from democratic governments like I would say Israel, have produced technologies that undermine human rights and sell them to entities and governments that are abusive abroad. Now, what we really need is for governments like the US to clean up their own acts, for example, by putting in place a comprehensive privacy legislation in the US, which would have knock-on effects around the world, but also to rein in these companies that have been shown to be contributing to abuses by, for example, exploring whether or not there should be kind of some form of multinational export control sanction regime on companies that on human rights grounds. Now, we have seen governments like the EU, for example, formulating national or regional digital policies. Some of that are right-centered, but these policies don't extend beyond these borders. We need kind of digital policy that center human rights that can make an impact around the world, that essentially would help people to better express themselves around the world, even though their governments will continue to be repressive. But this is the least, I think, democratic governments can do.
I can jump in. So I think 2 points. One, just to reinforce what Maya said. Across the world, we tend, I think, sometimes to look at things from maybe a little bit too technologically determinist point of view in terms of their impact on democracy and human rights. And one of the things that I've found that has been really important in looking at the effect of Chinese surveillance technology is that it matters not only what the technology is, and there are real risks to these technologies. Part of the reason I do the research on them is that I think those risks are real and very important to think through carefully. But I don't want us to throw up our hands and say, well, because the technology is out there, there's no way to prevent these negative impacts from occurring. It matters a lot what kind of political model the technology is employed within, and what the regulatory context, what the legal context is, what the sort of political decisions are that constrains the use of the technology and the data that comes from it. And so local, subnational governments, national governments have a lot of power to shape those rules and regulations at the global level, at the national level, and at the subnational level. And all three of those sets of tools are, I think, really important for thinking about how to translate technological capability into effect. I guess one other point that we haven't touched on at all, or at least not much today, that I did want to highlight is that, one of the things that Xi Jinping has done over the course of the last 10 years is in some ways to try to securitize the Chinese diaspora in terms of making stronger claims. And I think some of this language started under Hu Jintao, but it has been sort of more consistently invoked under Xi Jinping. Things like all the sons and daughters of China have an obligation to work for national rejuvenation. Right? That kind of language and claims to be able to police the behavior of Chinese diaspora members, in some cases regardless of citizenship status or geographic location. And what I thought was really interesting and in some ways very powerful about some of these protests was that the protests occurred not only within China itself, but then also globally. On university campuses around the world, outside the embassies in a number of places. And I think that that's a really interesting sort of transnational component, again, probably of concern to the authorities in China. But it was fascinating and inspiring also to see that dimension of the protest. And I suppose I just didn't want to lose sight of that as we switch to the global level, just to note that these were not only a domestic phenomenon inside China, but also had a transnational component or element that I think is just worth making sure we include as we think about their significance.
Absolutely, Xinan. Thank you so much for bringing that up to the discussion. And Xiaoqiang, you have about 4 minutes. I'll give you the last word.
Thank you. I may just re-summarize what I was trying to say, that this white paper movement has said everything that Chinese people finally got to say after 33 years after the Tiananmen massacre, which is Chinese people want democracy, do not want another emperor. And that is a political message. It's not going to realize right away. Even they relax COVID policy, even they crack down all these times, all the protesters, but that desire and demand will continue. That undercurrent will only getting stronger because we heard the voice of the Chinese youth. Another thing I wanted to say is this is at the highest point of Xi Jinping's power. And this is also the beginning of the end of his power. From now on, he's much more dangerous dictator of China and for the world too. And we must watch this extremely carefully.
Great, thank you all. I really want to thank our panelists today. You've provided a lot of insights and valuable perspectives on this, as yet still unfolding issue, and have brought some really important historical frameworks and perspectives for us to kind of put this in context. So I just want to thank you all again for your valuable perspectives, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kenton, Maya, Xiao, and Sheena for that fascinating conversation. It is a reminder of everyone's desire, and indeed right, to connect with each other, exchange ideas, and express themselves. It is also a stark reminder of how authoritarian governments increasingly depend on technological innovation to suppress those rights and maintain power. Our next conversation is about leading efforts in the European Union to build rules of the road in democratic and open societies. I'm happy to turn over to Rose Jackson to lead the conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here with two people we've had the pleasure of working with over the past few years as they've drafted and shepherded Europe's new twin regulations into force. As we've been tracking closely here at DFRLab, the European Union has enacted the Digital Services and Digital Markets Act, which combined amount to the most significant democratically aligned rewriting of the rules of the global internet. And while they are EU regulations, they focus on what are called very large platforms, meaning an increasingly incongruous global regulatory environment meets the combined power of the EU, focusing on the far reach of large platforms. And that has really significant implications for how the internet may exist for everyone around the world. We're honored to be joined here today by Gerard de Graaf, who's the European Union's first ambassador to Silicon Valley, and his colleague Prabhat Agarwal, the head of the European Commission's Digital Services and Platforms Unit. Gentlemen, welcome back to DFRLab and the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Rose.
Thank you again. We keep saying we've had the pleasure of having you guys over the course of this whole process, from the conception of the DSA and DMA through the negotiations and consultations, the passage, and now we're into the implementation stage. So I suppose I should kick this off just by asking, what comes next? We now have, Gerard, you've recently started this new office in Silicon Valley. Prabhat, you're focusing back in Brussels on really important questions around implementation. What should we be paying attention to over the next few months and year?
You know, we're building, Rose, thanks for the question. We're building up our new structure here, and it's quite an exciting period, actually. Building something new is always something very exciting, also obviously challenging, but we had a very good teams to start with throughout the work on the Digital Services Act, which is important to say didn't just start 2 or 3 years ago. You know, we had many years before. We already started to work on self and co-regulatory actions in the European Union, and so we've been working very closely on this topic for a long period of time. So it's really exciting to fold all of this knowledge now into a scale up, and it feels a bit like a startup ourselves, actually. So that's a bit the atmosphere. We moved into new offices here, which look like a startup office, and we're recruiting new people. We've got a call out there until the 19th of December for external staff. We're recruiting internally. So that's what we're building right now. So just to answer your question, what should you be looking out for? So we're going to be a bit quiet, outward looking for the next couple of months, while we build this team and we set up our structures, and then we build our capacity. So that's where we are at the moment.
Excellent. Gerard?
Well, we are definitely a startup because we're new and we're small, much smaller, of course, than the resources that are available in Brussels. We're now 4. We started on the 1st of September, and the focus is broader than DSA and DMA. It's part of the digital diplomacy. So we're looking at, say, the full kind of extent of the digital activities in the European Union, and also kind of how the European Union is building up its capacities in technology, and how it's kind of developing policies from digital skills all the way to kind of major investments in connectivity and in quantum and in other technologies. But obviously with the DSA and the DMA, and there is a strong interest here in Silicon Valley. And I think what we have noticed is that, because we have conversations at different levels, of course, with the companies that are most likely going to be designated as very large online platforms or gatekeepers. And I think here, there's a clear understanding that the negotiations are behind us, that, not everything maybe that is in the legislation is what the particular companies would have wanted to be in the legislation, but the focus is now quite clearly on implementation and on compliance. And I think it's in those discussions that we can help. I mean, what are the challenges that these companies face, and how can these kind of challenges be overcome before the measures actually enter into application, because they're into force now. But of course, there's still a little bit of time ahead of us before the measures will actually have to be complied with in practice. So this is the kind of conversations which we are having with big tech here in Silicon Valley. I mean, maybe a little bit more initially the attention on the DMA, on the DSA. I think we're now seeing kind of an acceleration and about kind of, okay, so also on the DSA, we probably have more to do, even though we are already doing a lot. So maybe there's a little bit of an underestimation on the DSA, what has to be done to comply fully with the requirements in the DSA. I mean, on the other hand, we have a lot of discussions also with like civil society, with academia, etc. And I think here the main takeaway for us is that there's actually quite not only strong interest, but quite a high degree of convergence that what the EU is doing makes sense. I mean, let's see how it then kind of turns out when it's implemented. But I mean, interestingly, a lot of support, which we had not expected as much for the approach that we have taken. And then last, but definitely not least, we've begun initial contacts also with the legislature in Sacramento, of course, with the midterms. I mean, they are now looking at kind of reconstituting the chambers for the next session, but also there we have detected quite some interest and some kind of looking at Europe as a source of inspiration for possible further reflection and action here in California. So that's like in a nutshell the experience that we have since we opened about 3 months ago.
Very, very busy. And I should say you opened at a really interesting moment for the US tech industry. We'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we're talking at a time that Twitter's in the news quite a bit. There have been massive tech layoffs. And I think it brings to the fore questions around things that I think in the past companies voluntarily did, whether we're talking about access to information and an understanding of what's happening on a platform, questions around transparency and data access, an understanding of certain policies and approaches to ensuring that the digital environment that we live on is secure and safe and dependable. I'm curious, as that's been transpiring, are you seeing companies at this moment come to you looking for advice on how to do things? Are they getting more serious about what those implementation questions might look like? And on the flip side, Pravat, as you're recruiting hundreds of new people into a completely new function, are you finding that there are the right mixes of people able to come join and answer these questions? What is that ecosystem looking like at a moment that feels, I'd say, pretty up in the air?
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Rose, maybe I forgot to mention one big milestone coming up on the 17th of February next year. So February 17th is really the date when platforms have to publish their user numbers. And that's a really important milestone. So it's something I wanted to throw out there because that's going to be the basis on which we are going to determine which ones are the large platforms that you mentioned and which ones are the not so large ones. So that's a really important marker down there. In terms of the recruitment, I think we see an uptick in interest also from people who worked in the tech sector and now interested in coming to join and work with us as a regulator. That's very interesting, and we've definitely seen a very large increase in interest. It's a bit early to see the mix of profiles, so we have set up also, I wanted to say, a center in Spain called the European Center for Algorithmic Transparency, and they're particularly focused on data science profiles, and they've seen quite a lot of interest as well. So I think overall, I'm quite optimistic. There are a lot of interested people out there, people who used to work for tech or who have a tech background as well, but also people who just love to do something, in this space and as a force for good. I think that's something that we really certainly see. So we understand that companies are going through increasingly economically challenging times. This is something we are aware of. Economic situations are going to be tough. I mean, we're going through a cold winter here in the European Union. you cannot tell, but normally I run around with a sweater, but I took it off for this, because the buildings are cold here in Europe, and the heating is turned down, and people feel it in Europe that this is going to be a cold winter, and many people are still taking in Ukrainian refugees. So the circumstances, not only for the tech industry, but the global economy is under pressure. We understand that. At the same time, the rules under the DSA and the DMA are not optional. They have to be factored in. Compliance has to be accounted for in these companies, and this is not something we can negotiate away or down. And what we're saying to companies is that this investment is important because, first of all, it's you only have to do this once for the whole European Union, whereas before the Digital Services Act and also before the Digital Markets Act, there was a kind of mushrooming of different national laws that would have actually had a much higher compliance cost if you add them all up. Having 27 different hoops that you have to jump through in order to do business in the European Union. That's not good for any business. So at least we have a single unified framework. We also see some indications from companies who are telling us that they would like to use this framework as the global framework that they have for just cost reasons, which we appreciate. So those are some elements of our conversations that I can share, I think, without breaching any of the confidentiality on these around these conversations.
That's really helpful. And Gerard, I'm wondering how you're experiencing it in Silicon Valley. Are you surprised by any of the questions and conversations that you're getting, or the reactions from industry that you may have expected to be different?
Well, I mean, not really. I think not major surprises. I think what is also interesting, I mean, obviously a lot of the attention goes to like the very large online platforms and the potential gatekeepers, but we have seen also a lot of interest and actually companies coming to us that see benefit, particularly in the Digital Markets Act. So this is an interesting dynamic. I mean, sometimes we portray the dynamic as like big tech versus, like, we'll call it the regulator, in this case, the European regulator, but it's actually big tech also versus each other. I mean, when we talk to some of these gatekeepers, they quite like some of the provisions because it might improve actually the conditions of access for themselves in particular markets, even though they might be less enthusiastic about provisions that kind of are more relevant to their own business model. So also there's an interesting dynamic between the gatekeepers, and some of the gatekeepers are coming to us and say, well, please make sure that for that other gatekeeper, the particular provisions are complied with, because that's important to our future business. And then the smaller ones are also kind of increasingly becoming active and kind of actually telling us, look, we are watching this. We are really relying on the European Union framework to overcome some of, say, the unfair practices that we've been suffering from for too long. So that's an interesting dynamic. It isn't like one side against the other side. If you can portray it, I mean, a regulator is never against kind of the regulated. And I think that's another, I think, important feature, is that we need a constructive relationship. And I think part of this is now being kind of developed. I mean, there's a lot of like pre-notification, I mean, upstream meetings with the platforms also. I mean, Prabhat and the colleagues in Brussels, we have some of these meetings here where a lot of these issues are discussed, are explored. I mean, guidance, I mean, the soft guidance given. And so that builds a constructive relationship between the regulator and those who will ultimately be regulated by the regulator. So I think from that perspective, positive. On the issue of employment, I mean, so of course something that we've looked at. I mean, some of the companies have reassured us that obviously, I mean, they pay particular attention when they do let people go, that it will not affect their capacity to implement, or at least to moderate content and to then implement also the DSA and the DMA. So I think there's also in the industry, there is an awareness that it's probably not so wise to start cutting into the areas where, frankly, you probably now need to step up rather than reduce your resources. So, but there are always kind of issues. I mean, you're of course aware of the one that probably is on everybody's mind, where there's a bit closer attention to what the effects might be on the capacity of that company and other companies to implement the DSA requirements.
Certainly. It's interesting to hear you talk about, and unsurprising, obviously, the kind of different parts of the ecosystem greeting the EU developments in their own way. So whether it's startups or medium-sized industry having their own reactions to the DMA specifically, or various platforms welcoming clarity and continuity on how to approach the entire EU system. I'm curious, now that you have an outpost in the United States, what those conversations are looking like in a context in which the U.S. has been a little bit behind in setting some of these standards. And I know, we can talk a little bit later about obviously the TTC and a number of other things that the EU is working on in this broader digital ecosystem. But have you found, are there things that you are seeing people work less on because they feel like the EU's got that part covered? Other things that you've heard people in the United States say that they welcome the EU having created a standard on? I'd love to hear a little bit about what it looks like to you as the EU now sitting in the United States grappling with a lot of these questions, some months and years behind where you are.
Well, I mean, over the last few years, I mean, we've been in close touch with the US as well as with other countries, but particularly with the US, and then particularly in the context of the Trade and the Technology Council, even whilst we were still conceiving and the negotiations were ongoing. So, and vice versa, the US has kept us very closely informed about its own initiatives, some of the executive orders that we've seen, and also the developments on the Hill, even though, of course, we know that it's difficult to get things agreed and passed on Capitol Hill for reasons which I think are wider than just the digital area. So in terms of problem analysis, in terms of direction, I think there's a high degree of convergence between the US administration and the EU. So that, I mean, yeah, maybe some things would have been done differently. I mean, we have a different political, legal tradition. So I mean, I don't think, anybody would be contemplating that the US would implement a similar version of the DSA and the DMA. But I think if the political capacity were there to do something in this area, then it would not be very dissimilar from what the EU has done in this area. Maybe not as comprehensive. So I think that's a positive. That means that I think and also positive towards the rest of the world, particularly also in the context of the DSA and the DMA and what's happening geostrategically. I mean, in terms of the implementation, of course, part of what is in the DSA will also bring, well, if I may say so, benefits outside. I mean, the risk management approach, of course, will, be done from a European perspective, but it will also kind of provide insights to third countries and of course, actors in third countries as to how these platforms are managing these risks. I mean, the transparency reporting, the access of data that maybe Prabhat can say a few more things about researchers. I mean, if US researchers would be working together with European researchers, there would be no reason why US researchers could also not benefit from these access provisions in the DSA. So yes, we are regulating for Europe, but de facto and in practice, the benefits will already be available to other parts of the world. And then we'll need to see. The questions that we are dealing with and we've been dealing with at the political level won't go away. How do you make the internet safer, and how do you protect your fundamental rights like freedom of speech? That's a fundamental issue that is being discussed in many, many parts of the world, and including in this country. That problem is not going to go away. Maybe the capacity is not there to deal with the issue at political level at the moment, but at some point that problem will need to be answered. And I think this is where the EU is now, the answers have now been given by the EU, and then other countries will need to think about how they will answer that question and to what extent they can benefit from the experience that the EU has already gained, and now, of course, with the implementation, even more how it will produce effect in society and in the market.
Certainly. And you mentioned the question of transparency and data access, which obviously the DFRLab has particular interest in as open source researchers in the digital ecosystem. But I appreciated in the past that both of you have characterize the EU approach to regulation as acknowledging that it's going to take some adjustment, that it is trying to find the best path, adjusting, learning, and growing as you discover more, which certainly looks a little bit different than in the US, where we kind of have to get something on the books and that's your last cut. So I'm curious, Pravat, particularly on the question of researcher access, data access, defining what transparency means for these platforms. What do you see both as most urgent? What are the things that you're hoping to give quickest attention to in defining? And where is it that communities like ours can plug in most productively as you're making these foundational decisions that will impact American researchers as well as a researcher in Kenya or Malaysia or anywhere in the world?
So the transparency piece in the DSA is kind of multifaceted, and what I usually like to say is there are kind of three parts to it. It's transparency towards the user, the normal user, and that needs to be simple language to understand, how the platform works, what is allowed, what is not allowed, and there the Digital Services Act makes some new rules. For example, the terms and conditions have to be so easy to understand that even children can understand them. So this is not the case right now. There are many jokes in the European Union about the length of terms and conditions that everybody clicks away. There's even an opera which is 3 hours long, somebody singing the Facebook terms and conditions. So that's something that is being regulated. And user-facing transparency also includes meta information about what happens when your content gets moderated, what kind of ways you have to complain about that and to get your content back online, that kind of stuff. There's a second piece, which is the kind of transparency for public scrutiny. So those are experts in the public, either journalists or NGOs or organizations such as yours, who kind of, take a bit of a closer look at what's happening on a platform, and they usually employ experts in the public domain. And so that's kind of what you could label kind of expert transparency. And these are the people who read transparency reports. I mean, normal users probably don't, or the majority, and they try and figure out what's going on well on the platform. So that's kind of expert transparency. And there we have a very far-reaching new rule, which is to extend that expert transparency to also academic researchers or independent researchers need to be vetted by a regulator and the research they carry out has to be linked to one of the risks. So it's not just anything, I have a research project, I want to get data from the platform, but it has to be linked to a risk in the European Union. But this is true. This provision hasn't got any geographical boundary, and so we've got a bit of time. It's about a year project, and so this provision will become active in spring 2024. So we're kicking off this project right now, and there will be quite an extensive consultation and workshops. And it's also an area where we are working together with our US partners under the Trade and Technology Council, but also with a wider academic community. And we are hoping to have a kind of inclusive and transparent and collaborative process around designing that so that it works for regulators, it works for researchers, and it gives that additional expert scrutiny that we think is really critical. There's a third part of our transparency piece, which is actually transparency towards the regulator. And that's usually, that's really looking under the hood of the car, if you like the analogy, and that gives, powers to the regulator to inspect what's going on inside the platforms. And that's an additional layer. Of course, all these three pieces play together, but this is a little bit how we think around about transparency in the Digital Services Act.
That's really helpful, and I know that a lot of the folks watching today are going to be interested in following up on that. So we'll do our best to help connect people from the community into that process. I wonder if we can take some time as well, though. I know that the EU writ large is working on so many different fronts, and so one question that comes up quite often is you went through this really long and very thorough process to develop the DSA and DMA, setting up these kind of core rules and standards. And then, of course, the next day, someone will ask a question about, well, what about immersive contexts? What about health tech? What about quantum? On and on and on and on. And I'm curious if you can speak to the ways that both of you, as well as the broader kind of EU ecosystem, is thinking about approaching future tech. How much of this is applying what you just built towards things that are coming? How much is needing to find where other parts of existing rules and laws apply in a digital context? And how do we collaboratively as a community work to ensure that as the internet changes quickly, the way that the public sector is able to ensure that public interest is reflected in that development creates a better digital world for everyone? A really easy question for me to throw at you. I'll start with Gerard.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I think first of all, I mean, this kind of mandate of this commission, of this European Parliament, I think is really about digital and green and climate change. I mean, those are the two priorities, and so that's like why the European Union is now pushing forward, like almost comprehensively. I mean, holistically, on a number of fronts. The DSA and the DMA have been adopted, are now about to be implemented, and we have the AI Act, we have the Data Act, we have measures on cybersecurity, we have the digital wallet, we have a lot of other things coming down the pike. So, but that, I think, once we have done all of this, and we're now looking like 1.5 years from now is the next European election. So, I mean, we want to get all of this past the post and then implemented, so that, say, the next phase, say, as of when 2024 is really an implementation phase. I don't think you will see, I mean, another wave of regulation coming out of the European Union as you have seen over the last kind of couple of years. Of course, we need to show that we can implement it. The proof of the pudding is always in the eating, is not in the preparation of the pudding. And then, I mean, what we have put in place is a foundation. This is kind of the horizontal elements, and it may well be. I mean, we are always regulating in a technology neutral way. I mean, if you look at the DSA, if you look at the DMA, we don't regulate the technologies. We regulate certain behaviors, certain practices, I mean, certain disciplines. So also, you remember the Electronic Commerce Directive, I mean, is now 22 years old. It will continue to exist. This is where the conditional liability provisions, for example, are integrated into. So we are quite confident, although you never know, that this framework of legislation will stand the test of time. I mean, how long? I mean, 20 years, maybe not, but definitely for, say, the next 10 years, it should be kind of okay. And then, I mean, it might be that, like you would have vertically, you will need in specific sectors, you will need to complement. I mean, we have the general product safety regulation, for example. It's based very largely on the DSA in terms of, like, certainly online marketplaces. But then you might need to go a little further in an area that is sectoral, whereas it rests on the horizontal. So it might be in medtech or in fintech or in financial services, AI. You might need to kind of make a little tweak because of the particularities of this sector. But again, the underlying foundation will be the AI Act, will be the Data Act, will be the DSA, will be the DMA. So that's the way I think we see the future. And I mean, we'll have to see whether kind of to what kind of new challenges will arise. I mean, the metaverse, our line is the DSA and the DMA and everything else will apply to the metaverse, which we will probably not call the metaverse. We'll call it like extended reality or immersive reality. So that's another, I think, very important principle, that we don't think kind of what we're doing is irrelevant to further technology development that is kind of already underway. No, I mean, the metaverse will have to comply with the DSA as much as kind of the current state of technology will need to comply with the DSA.
Prabhat, how much is that weighing into the process of designing the implementation itself, and how you're thinking about what it is that you're asking of companies or making sure is apparent to users?
Well, it does play a role. I mean, of course, we are now in the conversations we're having with companies, we're kind of making the reality check of how these rules now work with the specifics of a particular service or a particular company. That's ongoing, and you know that's clearly something that we're also contains a forward-looking element. You know, how will some of these services evolve in the future? I think so far we haven't really encountered any major problems of something that is obviously completely crazy, at least far away from it. There will always be challenging questions because technology is diverse and fast evolving, and not everything can be anticipated. What we have in the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act is actually another provision, which is not a regulatory provision per se. There's an obligation on the Commission to carry out foresight, horizon scanning, forward-looking work to actually anticipate emerging trends, not just because they should be regulated, but just to have this forward-looking. And one interesting provision in the Digital Services Act, in the higher number of the articles that only the experts kind of managed to read up to, are provisions that say that the Commission has to actually, watch emerging trends together with member states and external experts, and in order to make sure that the legislative framework or the policy framework is future-proof and can evolve. So we're setting that up as well. We already have a prototype for that. It's called an observatory of the online platform economy, and we're reconfiguring that now to take on these new obligations. And that's certainly something we'll be doing, and that will play in our role as well. And I think it's just 2 points that I don't think that the European Union is out to regulate every piece of tech that's on the planet, and you mentioned quantum earlier. That's an area where we're making a lot of investments. We have excellent research base in the European Union. And so this is an area where we really are investing a lot. There's no plan for regulation or anything like that as such, and certainly nobody says that the DSA will also regulate quantum technologies and so on. So what we are concerned with is areas where we perceive or we have evidence that there is a risk for society or for the economy, and those are, and we address that. So just to be clear that is not. I hear this quite a lot, that we're just out there to everyone.
Yeah. I'm curious on a similar front. We've talked a fair amount about the kind of precedent setting that the EU approach has, both in terms of the power of it just existing and companies having to respond to it, but also the significant work that went into answering hard questions and finding models of how you do these things. I'm curious how you balance that as someone that is serving the European public, while knowing that you do have this major global role as you are moving forward and implementing these twin regulations. What does it look like to engage with the rest of the world and balance those interests? Are there times that they feel like they're in conflict, or ways that it really feels like it's quite aligned and strengthens the EU position itself just to be a global leader?
A great question, Rose. And I think I need to say that it's true, first of all, that we get a lot of global interest at the moment. So we get a lot of countries asking us for presentations of what we're doing under the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. We are getting a lot of, we're really involved in a lot of bilateral and multilateral kind of discussions and give explanations. What we always stress is that the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act are embedded in a very strong fundamental rights framework in the European Union. And it's even in the texts and so on. So this is particularly strong for the Digital Services Act, but it's also relevant for the Digital Markets Act because maybe many of you viewers might not know, but the right to conduct a business is actually a charter protected fundamental right in the European Union. And it actually protects companies from excessive regulatory or arbitrary regulatory burdens, and so this is businesses are protected by our Charter of Fundamental Rights, just in the same way that people's speech is protected. Actually, it's on the same level. So this is one thing that is very important as we engage out there in the world, where we know that freedom of expression is not a universally respected human right. And so we stress very much when we engage with third countries that our framework is embedded into international human rights norms. I think this also brings me to another element that's very relevant, is that we are partners with a number of countries in the US under the Declaration for the Future of the Internet. And this is precisely because that's an affirmation by more than 60 countries now of the importance of international human rights norms within which we need to carry out regulatory processes. And we are really advocates and strong supporters of the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, precisely because the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act are so deeply embedded in an international human rights framework, and this is one of the things that I'm personally quite proud of, that we believe in. So as we're having these conversations with other countries, we keep stressing that this is it's not just about the content of the rules, but it's also the constitutional framework in which they are embedded. So. And so that's maybe one thing that I wanted to just point out on top there.
No, that's excellent, and music to our democracy-focused ears, of course, and certainly has changed the dynamic of the conversation I think that countries are having to pin a conversation out of abstraction and into an actual model. And I think sometimes, certainly in the United States, we don't have core regulations on data protection. We don't have much in the way of a kind of cohesive set of standards. And so as we look to different models that the UK is pushing forward, that the Canadian government has pushed forward, India, Brazil, and name any number of countries in a more democratic space, let alone the way that the authoritarian world is driving forward its contradictory approach, it's really interesting to watch countries adjust to a new reality in which there is a standard and a stake in the ground. Two kind of closing questions for you. One is, what are you most optimistic about? So this is a huge amount of work that has been pushed through over the last few years. I hope that you managed to get a few naps in, maybe a small vacation before trying to build the entire architecture for implementing it. But what are you most looking forward to and most optimistic about now that you've kind of built this foundation?
Rose, what I'm actually most optimistic about is not so much the tension between the regulator and the platforms under these frameworks, but it's actually under the DSA, the empowerment we give to civil society actors, to advocates, to journalists, to actually scrutinize the system that is so important to our democracies. And I think that this is really what I'm most optimistic about. Of course, we are taking our regulatory powers very seriously, and we will use them, as we are building our structure. This is a very important element. But I think the real power and the thing that makes me optimistic is the ability, particularly of the DSA, to surface data, in a way that has never been done before, and that allows actually to have an evidence-based conversation, a data-based conversation on what's actually going on, and allows then the society, whether it's in the US or in the European Union or elsewhere, to have an informed discussion based on data and facts about how we should address them. So that's actually what I'm really optimistic about, and then our regulatory powers sit on top of that. But the real power of the framework comes actually from empowering others to have a discussion about what our society should look like, when these platforms are such a big part of it, and this is not anti or pro someone, but this is simply saying that we're giving power to the people to understand what's going on, and I think that good things will come from that. That's what I'm most optimistic about.
So I'll take this chance to throw the same question to you, Gerard. What are you most optimistic about now that you've gotten through the main passage of all of these foundational laws and approaches?
Well, I think with the DSA and the DMA and the other kind of regulatory initiatives that are coming down the pike, we have a framework that kind of can help us to build a more positive internet, an internet that kind of brings us together, that kind of no longer divides as much as it sometimes does, that can help underpin and reinforce our democracies and I think just make us a better society. And then with the DMA, I think we we're hopeful we'll see the continuation and an intensification of innovation that this kind of sector of digital is so famous for, but that unfortunately we have not seen maybe as much as we could have had the market been more open. So it's the effects that I think we can be most hopeful about, and that's what I think where we need all of us, not just us in the EU, but all stakeholders, including the industry, civil society, academia, I mean, policymakers all over the world, particularly if you see where the internet under threat, if we can offer a positive model that supports our democracy, that brings prosperity, that improves our quality of life, I think that's something that I think holds a lot of hope for the future.
That's all noble goals, and as I've said before, we view very much the digital world as responsible to an ecosystem of people that all have to play their roles. And so we're very excited to have the partnership that we have with both of you and with all of the work that the European Union has put forward. We hope that the civil society community that, as Prabhat alluded to, has to play its role of being an independent verifier and part of its ecosystem, that the industry upon which we rely on for so many things, that this helps create a framework for moving forward. And we very much look forward to partnering with you, and hope that we can have you back on our stage again and more conversations in the coming months. But thank you for giving of your time, and really excited to see where this goes. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rose. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
The internet has had a number of international groups that you've likely never heard of, but have an enormous amount of power, and our next session is about one of them.
More than a decade ago, as the Arab Spring loomed large in the global imagination, 14 democracies joined together in creating what they called the Freedom Online Coalition. In addition to a slightly comical acronym, together the group created a new mechanism for countries to collaborate and build shared power to protect human rights online. As the world was watching, brave activists leveraged the internet in surprising ways to express their democratic desires.
They were also watching as some governments then shuttered the internet, used sophisticated spyware to find and silence dissidents, and launched a dangerous cat and mouse game of innovation and repression still at play today. Now, a lot has happened since 2011, and not all of it particularly good for the free, open, secure, and interoperable internet upon which our business, innovation, democratic, and social worlds rely.
Today, the picture is more complicated, with democratic governments espousing internet freedom principles internationally, while not always matching those aspirations with laws and techniques at home. And with companies that were once scrappy startups now operating as multinational behemoths with the budget, influence, and footprint to rival nations. All of this bending towards market forces and geopolitical realities that are often at odds with the universal rights our global order is built around.
In that time, the FOC has suffered from a lack of attention, resourcing, and multinational engagement, which is why many of you listening today may not be too familiar with it. And yet today, with the consequences of authoritarianism on display, whether Russia's brazen assault of Ukraine, or China's increasingly muscular use of its market power to shape global outcomes, democracies keep coming back to the need for a democratic tech alliance.
So as the US prepares to take over as chair of the more than decade-old original Democratic Tech Alliance, we gathered experts present at the creation and through key junctures in the organization's development and asked them, does the FOC still have a role in the world? And if so, what is it? And how can the US and its allies best leverage this year of leadership to help the coalition deliver on its promise of building real power through the collective action of democracies focused on ensuring that the digital world remains free, open, secure, and interoperable for everyone, everywhere?
Those consultations informed a series of recommendations, as well as a document we're excited to release today that provides a primer on the coalition's history, structure, and operations. You can find that introduction on the StratCom website and social media channels.
I want to thank everyone who contributed to that document, especially DFRLab staff Jacqueline Mello-Ray and Leah Fidler, and the 20-odd experts who gave of their time over the last few months to help make this important body a little bit more accessible to those of you tuning in now.
Let's get down to business with the substance. We're thrilled to welcome to our StratCom stage today a three-part program. First, we're honored to be joined by David Morrison, the Canadian Deputy Foreign Minister, who will deliver introductory remarks on behalf of the Government of Canada, which is the current chair of the Freedom Online Coalition.
You'll then hear from Ann Neuberger, the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, who will deliver remarks on behalf of the U.S. government as the incoming chair of the coalition.
A handoff, if you will. And then immediately following, we're pleased to host an exciting panel of civil society and former government leaders who were involved in the formation and the reform of the coalition over the years. They'll discuss the role of the FOC at this critical juncture and what it will take to help it live up to its potential.
Leading that conversation is one of our non-resident fellows here at the DFRLab and the CEO and founder of Connect Humanity, Yochai Ben-Avi. In addition to founding RightsCon, Yochai has been at the forefront of internet freedom issues at Access Now as the public policy lead for Mozilla, and now in ensuring the next billion are connected in a rights-respecting and equitable way. So without further ado, it's my honor to pass the stage to Deputy Foreign Minister Morrison. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you there today in person, but I did want to commend the Atlantic Council for putting together such a timely event, and in particular for organizing this important session on the Freedom Online Coalition. I think we are all united by the belief that one of the most pressing challenges of our time is how we can benefit from digital technology in ways that protect human rights and uphold our shared democratic values. It is clear to us here in Canada that the FOC, the only multilateral coalition committed to building a future where digital progress benefits everyone, has a big role to play in answering this challenge. As 2022 chair of the FOC, Canada is proud to have advanced our collective vision of democracy in a digital age grounded in digital inclusion. There are 4 essential components to digital inclusion: connectivity, digital literacy, civic participation, and safety online. Greater connectivity to bridge digital divides worldwide and within our societies. Digital literacy to ensure users are empowered to navigate diverse content online. Civic participation, free from hate speech and disinformation, unduly restrictive censorship, internet shutdowns, and other oppressive practices. And building a safe online ecosystem for all. Collectively advancing digital inclusion allows us to imagine and begin to advance a world where digital progress benefits everyone. The Freedom Online Coalition is an ideal vehicle for this collective action. It is driven by like-minded democracies and powered by civil society, industry, and academic expertise through the Active Advisory Network. The strength of our collective action has demonstrated that amidst democratic decline and rising digital authoritarianism, the FOC continues to play a pivotal role in promoting a human rights-based approach to the governance of digital technologies and the Internet. Since assuming the role of chair of the FOC in January 2022, Canada has led the coalition's efforts to advance digital inclusion by shaping global norms through diplomatic coordination and multi-stakeholder engagement through our ambitious 23 Commitment Program of Action. We've advanced our vision in several other ways. First, we've actively worked to affirm and shape global norms by strengthening and expanding diplomatic networks in Paris, Geneva, and New York to share information, coordinate positions, and advance strategies to promote internet freedom and human rights online in priority forums. Whether it was calling out Russia's state-sponsored disinformation in Ukraine or drawing attention to internet shutdowns taking place in Iran, we shone light on egregious situations around the world that undermine human rights and fundamental freedoms online. Second, Canada has been committed to enhancing the FOC's visibility and presence. We launched the My Digital Inclusion social media campaign to highlight the importance of advancing digital inclusion, which has since reached an estimated audience of 13 million in over 50 countries. This has also made this past year the FOC's most active year on social media. Third, Canada has been working to develop the Ottawa Agenda for Digital Inclusion this year. This was done in part by hosting consultations around the world to gather insights about challenges to internet freedom and best ways forward. If we are to counter the greatest digital threats facing democracy today, to defend internet freedom and push back against digital authoritarianism, we are going to need a collective response, one rooted in multilateralism and multi-stakeholder engagement. These are the foundations that have informed the Ottawa Agenda. I am pleased that as we finish our chairship of the FOC, we will launch the Ottawa Agenda in January. And working closely with the U.S. as the next chair of the FOC, this agenda will forge a pathway forward for the promotion of internet freedom over the course of the coming decade to work together towards a rules-based, democratic, and digitally inclusive world. Finally, we are committed to growing our networks and welcoming new members. We are thrilled that Chile has joined the FOC as its 35th member and that Taiwan has expressed interest in joining as an observer to the coalition. Canada's chairship may be coming to a close, but we will continue to support the FOC's mission to protect human rights online. We look forward to working closely with the U.S. as they assume the role of chair of the coalition in 2023. We are thrilled to see the U.S. retaining the digital inclusion framework and its commitment to continue the work of bolstering the FOC's capacity to make it an effective, action-oriented coalition. We are delighted that our U.S. colleagues have supported the Ottawa Agenda through its development this year and have committed to advance it through their chairship next year. I don't think I have to remind this audience that the governance of digital technologies is already a crucial geopolitical arena that will significantly impact the future of our democracies. The Freedom Online Coalition gives us a platform to act. So, to everyone present, let us prioritize restoring trust in the digital space. Let us continue to put people first, and together, let's keep building a better future for all. Thank you very much.
Hello, and greetings from the White House. My name is Ann Neuberger, and I am the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. It's a pleasure to join you all today, albeit virtually. My thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important event. Today's discussion is particularly timely, as next month the United States will become chair of the Freedom Online Coalition of the FOC for the first time in the body's 11-year history. We in the White House are excited to build on Canada's terrific work as the current FOC chair and to advance the efforts of our fellow members of the FOC and the broader internet freedom community. From President Biden down, the U.S. government is committed to strengthening the institution's vital work as a critical part of the administration's overall support to internet freedom and promoting respect for human rights online. In fact, we're excited that Chile joined the FOC as its 35th member last week. As part of President Biden's commitment to expand the Freedom Online Coalition, we look forward to welcoming additional members in the coming months. Before I outline our priorities for our term as chair, let me take a step back and provide some broader context. When the Freedom Online Coalition launched in 2011, we lived in a time of high expectations around the liberalizing power of information and communication technologies. The number of internet users had grown exponentially throughout the prior decade. Social media revolutions had galvanized the democratic aspirations of millions around the world. The immense promise of the internet as a single, interconnected communication system for all of humanity heralded unimaginable innovations, unfettered access to knowledge, and truly unprecedented economic opportunities for billions of people. The Freedom Online Coalition was created to protect the promise of this network of networks, and in the intervening decade has become a unique, international, multi-stakeholder effort to support internet freedom and promote respect for human rights online. And over the past 11 years, many aspects of what we thought would be the Internet's promise have indeed been realized, or even in some cases surpassed, when it comes to commerce, learning, connection, and beyond. And yet the transformative impact of the Internet has included, as we all know, a series of troubling developments. The Internet remains a critical tool for those on the front lines of the struggle for human rights. Activists and everyday people from Tehran to Shanghai to St. Petersburg depend on access to an unblocked, unfiltered Internet to communicate and gain information otherwise denied to them by their governments. But the promise of digital technologies has become paired with concerns about the peril posed by their misuse, to repress, including by governments trying to control populations, to stifle dissent, and to surveil and censor. That is one of the reasons this 35-member coalition is so vital. Through the FOC, we've joined with our partners to speak out against threats to human rights online, including in response to Russia's unprovoked and unjust war against Ukraine, to compare lessons learned in our individual and joint efforts to provide support for Internet freedom in contexts where it is under attack, and evaluate what more we can do to support those individuals, such as human rights defenders and activists who are most under threat. These efforts are important, and we've seen concrete results from them. But in each year over the past decade, global Internet freedom has declined. With each passing year, the Internet has grown more closed, more insecure, and more fractured, as governments and non-governmental actors alike exploit emerging digital technologies to find new ways to violate human rights and fundamental freedoms. Additionally, we recognize the profoundly chilling effect of targeted online harassment and abuse we're seeing on women and girls, LGBTQI+ individuals, and other marginalized groups, which undermines their ability to exercise their human rights, including the right to freedom of expression, compounding the forms of violence they face online, and exacerbating the digital divide. In short, we're at an inflection point. As the FOC enters its second decade, we must acknowledge that the same strategies and tactics we've used previously to advance our affirmative democratic vision for the Internet, one that's open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure, must also evolve to meet this moment. The United States is committed to leading these efforts in partnership with like-minded governments, civil society, industry, and other stakeholders. And the Biden-Harris administration has prioritized protecting and defending human rights online worldwide and strengthening democratic norms, values, and institutions in an increasingly digital age. That's why, at the first Summit for Democracy in December 2021, President Biden committed to not only expand the FOC's membership, but also to deepen the coalition's diplomatic efforts to address the challenges and opportunities of digital technologies. And it is why in April, the United States, together with over 60 other countries, launched a Declaration for the Future of the Internet, which aligns with the principles of the Freedom Online Coalition, and reaffirmed our commitment to protecting human rights online and ensuring all people can enjoy the advancement and benefit that technological development can deliver. As we move forward with operationalizing the DFI, we're also putting our words into action as the chair of the FOC for 2023. Over the next year, we will pursue 3 priorities to help achieve our long-term vision. First, we will bolster existing efforts where the FOC adds unique value. In October of this year, the FOC issued a statement addressing the Iranian government's internet shutdowns as part of its wider crackdown on protesters, and in line with the Iranian government's long-standing pattern of censorship. This was a first for the FOC, and we will continue to call out governments when they misuse technology against their own people. Second, we will strengthen coordination between the FOC's policies and the foreign assistance that participating states are providing in support of national-level technology frameworks around the globe, alignment with human rights. Third, we will strengthen the FOC through improved operating mechanics, the nuts and bolts of what makes an international coalition effective and efficient, to make sure the FOC is set up for greater impact for years to come. We plan to work closely with past and future chairs to strengthen continuity year to year and improve our strategic planning. but we're not just focused on the FOC's day-to-day process. We also intend to further bolster the coalition's policy work on a number of fronts. We'll remain laser-focused on the FOC's mission to protect fundamental freedoms, including through countering network disruptions. To bolster this work, we will look to improve and increase our support to efforts that increase access to the internet and fact-based information globally. We will focus on countering the rise of digital authoritarianism and the misuse of digital technologies. The administration has already taken concrete steps to counter the proliferation of commercial spyware and misuse of surveillance technologies. We will ensure a dedicated focus on emerging technologies, namely with respect to enabling the responsible development and use of artificial intelligence in ways that respect human rights and allow all members of humanity to benefit from the incredible potential development of these technologies. We will continue our focus on strengthening digital inclusion to include efforts to support ongoing initiatives to promote safe online spaces, particularly for women and girls, LGBTQI+ persons, persons with disabilities, and other marginalized groups. We look forward to working with you all in the coming months to develop new ideas for the FOC and strengthen it as an institution. Thank you and be well.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to 360 StratCom and today's session, the Democratic Tech Alliance You've Never Heard of, How the FOC Can Live Up to Its Promise. My name is Yochai Ben-Avi. I am the co-founder and CEO of Connect Humanity, a fund to accelerate digital equity for all, and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. And I am joined today by an incredible panel. First up is Catherine Marr, who is the former CEO of the Wikimedia Foundation and currently serves on the Secretary of State's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. And she previously participated in the FOC working groups that were considering reforms of the body. Next, we have joining us is Jason Pielmeyer, the Executive Director of the Global Network Initiative. He previously was a special advisor at the U.S. Department of State, where he led the Internet Freedom, Business, and Human Rights section in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and held the FOC portfolio and has served on the FOC's advisory network since its launch. And finally, a pleasure to have with us Dr. Tatiana Tropina, an assistant professor in cybersecurity governance at the Institute of Security and Global Affairs at Leiden University. She is a cybercrime expert and a longtime member of the FOC's advisory network. In fact, she is the incoming co-chair of the FOC advisory network. Thank you all so much for being here today. Never before has the call been louder for democratic countries to take coordinated action in defense of a free and open and secure and interoperable internet. I think I got all of them. At the same time as countries spin up new mechanisms and initiatives to collaborate on everything from supply chains to emerging technology, a more than decade-old coalition for democracies is, driving the defense of a rights-aligned digital world is at this sort of inflection point in its history. And so for those a little less familiar with the Freedom Online Coalition, founded in the wake of the Arab Spring, which brought, I think newfound attention and energy and resources to the growing movement for internet freedom and digital rights, the Freedom Online Coalition was launched in 2011 with an original group of 13 countries. Their mission, to be a proactive coalition that ensures internet freedom issues are on the international policy agenda as a way to drive concrete policy changes and outcomes. Since then, the FOC has served as a coordination mechanism to advance internet freedom, digital rights, including in various multilateral and multi-stakeholder fora. It's been a place for governments and other stakeholders to discuss and learn about emerging digital rights threats and developments, to develop policy guidance on key internet policy topics. Shout out to my former members of Working Group 1. Remember governments to reflect on and further develop their own policies and positions. And from time to time as a venue where governments can take collective action publicly and privately, including through periodic statements by members. Today, this Democratic Tech Alliance you've never heard of boasts 34 member governments. So today we will dive into the opportunities and challenges for the FOC. We'll talk about some of the opportunities that lie ahead as the United States government takes over as chair, and discuss the best path forward for this coalition to meet the needs of the moment. And so to kick off our conversation today, I really want to pick up on the part of the session title, How the FOC Can Live Up to Its Promise. And we'd love to hear from everyone on this. What do you think the best version of the FOC would look like if it was thriving, effective, operating at its fullest potential? What would the FOC be capable of? And Catherine, let's start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, Yochai, as you were speaking about the beginning of the FOC, I was remembering those heady days. It was a really powerful group of countries when it first got together, and there was a lot of expectation around the impact that it would have. The 2011 context was a very different one in many ways, both geopolitically across the globe in terms of where the priorities were relative to our understanding of democratic transitions and sort of the drumbeat of a democratic advance, whereas we're now hearing the drumbeat perhaps of a democratic retreat, unfortunately, as the data would show us, and a great hope for the power of the internet in terms of its ability to really advance those democratic priorities. So not just a secure, open, interoperable internet, but the idea that an open, interoperable, secure internet would also lead to a robust, thriving democracy. I think that the FOC, if it were to achieve its greatest potential, it would go back to those sort of first principles upon which it was founded and recognize and articulate very powerfully the connection between pluralistic open societies and a secure, interoperable, open, free internet. And I think that that is one of the things from a narrative perspective for policymakers that the FOC could be most effective at, really translating between the priorities of the internet governance community, the regulatory community, the role of internet in foreign policy, both as a modality of foreign policy, as a associated tool relative to other foreign policy priorities, and just on its own terms, to be able to drive that conversation and connection to the overall goals of why the multilateral system is a better system when it has more open means of discourse and governance. And so just drawing that connection. Having said that, there are obviously some very specific things that the FOC would look like, or ways that it would look if it was really to be successful. And I think that that's really where the meat of this conversation should be, is should it be a more expansive network? Should it be a more highly structured network with greater resources and operating bodies and sort of modalities of functioning? And that's where I've got my own opinions, but I want to be able to hand it over to my colleagues, because you just asked that one question, and I think that that's where the meat of the panel of discussion will be.
I have furiously taken notes for us to come back to a lot of those great points. Thanks, Catherine. Tatiana, maybe you could share sort of your vision and your take, and especially if you disagree with Catherine on anything.
Actually, I violently agree with Catherine, and yeah, absolutely. But I have a bit of nuances to add, right? So my involvement with Freedom Online Coalition, of course, doesn't date back that far. I think I joined at the beginning, somewhere in the middle of the work of the working group, which was called Internet Free and Secure. And there was so much promise in this work. And the coalition and its members came up with very strong statements and documents. And basically, if they could only live by those statements, if they can only live by those promises, sometimes I feel like all the work that has been done by working groups, all the work that Freedom Online Coalition has done since 2011 gets dusted and binned, Once this shiny new document, once this shiny new statement goes out, it feels like, okay, the work has ended. And if I may add a bit of granularity here, for example, I'm participating in various fora related to internet governance, foreign policy, cyber norms. And I feel like what Freedom Online Coalition has succeeded in delivering a clear message, but what it has not achieved any success with is internal coordination within its members on the ground. One department knows about this message, goes to, RightsCon, internet governance event, delivers it. At the same time, at some foreign policy event, another department comes and delivers delivers an absolutely different message. And when you approach these people and ask, are you actually aware about your country signing up for these values and even like kind of promising to live by these values? Oh, Freedom Online Coalition, I've never heard of this. Or maybe I heard of this, but I've never heard about this statement. And what I like about this initial punchline, the coalition you have never heard of, I wonder why, because this year, for example, Freedom Online Coalition got into G7 communique. So those of us who have not heard about it probably never read this communique. But it also shows the complexity of the environment Freedom Online Coalition operates in. So this is just few nuances, few statements, and I'm happy to elaborate further.
Thank you. Yeah. Jason, I'm so glad you're up next because you've held the sort of FOC portfolio at one of the member governments, and so wonder if you could maybe give your perspective, to Tatiana's question, sort of that when we don't always see that kind of coordination and that commitment to the FOC principles, sort of across whole of government, and some of how do we sort of mainstream that further and have that more internalized by the member countries in terms of how they show up around the world.
Yeah, I mean, that's $1 million question, not just for the FOC, but for just about all foreign policy issues that cross over into domestic policy. But yeah, I had first of all, thank you so much for having me on this panel. And it's a real honor to be here with the three of you. I really, really admire and respect, and really glad to have a chance to talk about the FOC at this important moment as the US government is coming in to take the chair. As you noted, Yochai, I was at the State Department in the sort of 2014 to 2017 period, had the FOC file. Folks may remember that time as kind of the wake of the Snowden revelation. So it was a really interesting time to be not only working on these issues, internet freedom, but also to be trying to deal with this kind of internal sort of engagement with other parts of the US government to figure out what is our messaging, what is it that we can say and should be doing to demonstrate that we're not just rhetorically committed to these human rights-based principles in our foreign policy, but really concretely committed to living up to them domestically and through all of our various relevant activities, whether law enforcement or intelligence or otherwise. And I think, the working groups were a really useful mechanism, and we'll maybe kind of explain that a little bit as we go through the conversation. The working groups were the first attempt by the FOC to start to work outside of just the member governments that early on joined in. And so I think the three of you were involved in the working group one that's come up a couple of times, the Internet Free and Secure, which is really looking at cybersecurity and how do we think about cybersecurity through a human rights lens. I was working at the same time, most focused on working group 3, which was about transparency and privacy. And that really became about the Snowden revelations and this question of consistency between commitment and practice. And it was really interesting because it actually gave us the Snowden revelations in a way at the time didn't feel like a gift, but it gave us an opportunity to go to various parts of the U.S. government that we might not have otherwise naturally thought to engage, as part of the Freedom Online Coalition and our broader internet freedom foreign policy, and say, look, we gotta have some conversations. We gotta talk about this. Like, we've been saying these things in UN resolutions and in speeches that our principals are giving in various forums. And there's some really, good questions that we're getting in response, and we need to figure out how to answer them. And, so through working group 3, we were able to get some pretty senior officials from the National Security Division at the Justice Department, from the Office of Director of National Intelligence, to answer some questions from that working group, to engage in a live, video conference kind of like this, not public, but with the working group members. And be responsive and sort of talk through how they thought about these things. The Dutch government and the UK government did similar exercises, bringing in some of their internal sort of domestic focused, security focused ministries into conversation with the working group. And it was really interesting. I mean, it was really interesting.
Yeah.
Being the puppet master trying to coordinate that in the back end, but it was also, I think, really useful for the working group members to have those opportunities to engage and to see that, look, there are real people here that they do understand these values. we may think of them a little bit different because operationally their jobs mean different things. But that was valuable. I think, unfortunately, we sort of got over that hump, and things moved on, different priorities emerged. And so I guess what I want to say about that period is it, to me, demonstrated that you can have this deeper engagement with the sort of foreign policy principle-based mechanism, here being the Freedom Online Coalition, helping to drive that. It is possible to do that. To do it consistently and robustly is of course even harder. But I do agree with Tatiana that is an important thing for the FOC to be able to continue to demonstrate. Not only, again, to sort of just demonstrate that there's consistency, but then to be able to then ensure that we are coordinating horizontally better, so that when people from the Justice Department are giving cybercrime trainings in Tanzania, or people from DHS, the Homeland Security CERT, are giving trainings to other CERTs in Albania.
I mean, I remember those conversations. I mean, I that for me as a outside of government sort of participants of those conversations, I think that bringing key stakeholders from across government to sort of seriously wrestle with the kind of questions and sort of value statements, and how does that show up both in foreign policy and domestic policy, and sort of be at the table with people, really engaging with the conversation from across government, was one of the most sort of tangible demonstrations of the value of FOC as a sort of member of civil society at the time. I want to sort of tie these things, governments go to different fora for different things. I think I want to sort of move quickly through this. Maybe we can go longer than a Vine, but shorter than a TikTok on, what is the role of sort of FOC vis-a-vis other multilateral and multi-stakeholder bodies? Like, what are the things if you're in the State Department, Jason, have any number of different coalitions, alliances, fora, and venue that you can go to. What is the sort of stuff you say, well, we ought to go to the FOC for this, we ought to go to another body for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious connections, the FOC was very much set up, I think, with certain models in mind, and the community of democracies, some of the other coalitions that were being built, coalitions of kind of like-minded governments around issues that were controversial or where the politics were challenging at the UN, right? So you have these UN bodies, Human Rights Council, the Third Committee of the General Assembly, specialized agencies like UNESCO that have a mandate to deal with human rights issues, but also have to coordinate across all of the UN member states, and that's tricky. And so there was there has been over time, I think, a strategy that democratic governments and increasingly non-government governments have engaged in, of kind of building parallel institutions. I in previous writing called them creative multilateral initiatives, to help sort of foster better collaboration and coordination in those venues. And so the FOC most concretely has demonstrated ability to do that in the sort of human rights focused bodies, UNESCO, Human Rights Council, Third Committee. I think where perhaps there needs to be more focus are on the less human rights focused bodies. So there are several UN specialized agencies that have important internet governance responsibilities, but don't see themselves primarily as human rights focused. There are then other UN specialized agencies that get into cybersecurity work and capacity building, and then there are other regional bodies like the Council of Europe that also have important mechanisms for multilateral assistance and for norm building, capacity development. And so that's where I hope that the FOC can continue to sort of identify those slightly more adjacent spaces as opportunities. Sorry, headphone malfunction.
I'll take the opportunity of Jason's headphone falling out too. Sorry, I really want to highlight that because I think, in an ideal world, right, we would see sort of digital rights and democracy sort of mainstream throughout sort of all conversations, right, and all sort of relationships. And I think the power of the FOC, given its internationally distributed membership, to sort of build those connections between like-minded nations, to sort of act together and, in at least in sort of loose coordination, if not formal collective action, especially in other spaces, to make sure that those values are being defended and extended. I think can be super powerful. And I think we saw more of that, frankly, in the earlier days of the FOC. As we've seen some changes in governments, both administrations and just personnel, I think some of that trust and some of that connection has been lost, but I think that's a super powerful area for a reinvigorated FOC to focus on. This, I think, sort of also teases up a sort of interesting question of like, should the FOC be a small tent of, fairly like-minded countries who, because of that sort of limited nature, can really sort of more effectively coordinate together, have that high trust and coordination? Or should the FOC as a coalition serve as a big tent that's trying to bring more countries into sort of the democratic, rights-respecting fold? And so would love to hear from all of our panelists, sort of big tent, small tent, and why. Ms. Mar.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to go to Tatiana, given her more recent work. Actually, I do have feelings on it, but I'm actually very curious. And may I throw?
Yeah. I would say, to me, it's already not a small tent. I'm sorry, 34 countries is 1/5 of the world number of countries, right? So I do not feel that the Freedom Online Coalition is ready for a larger membership, especially with the states that are not like-minded, and I will explain why. I think that one of the weaknesses of the Freedom Online Coalition, current weaknesses, it is not clear how the member countries are actually living up to these values, how they are coordinating among themselves and internally, and I already pointed to this. But I think with a growing number of countries, especially those who might be on the fence, some gray areas, you cannot take a superior position and say, you have to do your due diligence, and and basically we do not have mechanisms to enforce this obligation. Through the years, I do think that in the complexity of the challenges in this complex environment of new technologies, developing technologies, like when I look at the documents of Freedom Online Coalition today, what do I see? Before they were talking about, complex but simple issues, cybersecurity, privacy, freedom of speech. Now we see artificial intelligence, gender issues, something else, and it piles up, right? So in this complexity, navigating the gray zones becomes much and much harder. So I think that either Freedom Online Coalition goes to the basics and extends its membership based on some really identified values and principles, and the countries are going to be called out for not following them, or in this complex environment, I constantly see that the previous commitments to these basic values are being watered down. We were talking about multi-stakeholder internet governance 10 years ago. Now, all of a sudden, most of the documents are talking about multi-stakeholder cooperation, which is, I'm sorry, it is not the same. It is not the same. So I constantly feel like from more of a powerhouse, Freedom Online Coalition is moving to a coordination body, but then what's the point here? What are you coordinating, right? And how you're living up to this promise. So I do feel that I don't like closed clubs, right? I do not. But I do think that it's maybe some models with more involvement, engagement, external outreach, cooperation, agile models, more flexible models might be a good idea. But to become a member of the Freedom Online Coalition, I think that the Freedom Online Coalition should be careful with how it carries out its business, how committed these countries are to fundamental freedoms, and how Freedom Online Coalition is actually going to coordinate in the complex environment when many states have their own opinions. The Freedom Online Coalition, there would be 60 states, might end up with no statement at all. Look at the UN model. Look at the General Assembly and what is going on there.
So may I just jump in
here?
here?
Do it.
Okay, so one of the things that came up for me, I told you I had thoughts, is really about, is this meant to be intrinsic or instrumental, right? And so the intrinsic worth of an open interoperable internet is what I said at the very beginning. It is the idea that an open interoperable internet facilitates the functioning of pluralistic open societies. It is the idea that it is something that enables the realization of rights and it protects those rights. That, to me, is an intrinsic understanding of the value of the Freedom Online Coalition. An instrumental understanding of the Freedom Online Coalition is simply an open and interoperable internet, which is to say a focus on the protocol sort of level of governance. And I think that having some sort of understanding and clarity about that among the members is actually of critical importance, because of the fact that I think very often we just aren't clear enough when we talk about open interoperable internet that this is meant to be a means to an end, the end of which is actually a position on a form of governance that is the best form of governance. And so if we talk about a broad tent, we need to be clear with the members of that broad tent that they're committing not only to the idea of open interoperable internet for instrumental reasons, but also open pluralistic rights respecting societies for intrinsic reasons. And I think that automatically makes it much, much clearer the sorts of tents that we are engaged in, how big they are, how far out those stakes are. Now, having said that, I think Tatiana brings up an excellent point, which is there is I wouldn't go so far to say it would be hypocrisy, but certainly a lack of consistency within the members as to how and which parts of that commitment they uphold in their own policies, let alone their own sort of functioning capacity of governance and their domestic governance models. And so I think that again returns to this interesting point that Tatiana raised, that is always the debate, which is, are we bringing folks in to nudge them along the path to better governance, or are we holding the line to say only those who meet the standards of this governance are welcome? And for the multi-stakeholder world, this is an incredibly interesting challenge that is probably true in other sectors, but I just don't know them as well, where we see that very often civil society is the stakeholder that we want to bring into the room on some of these, particularly in some of these countries that are on the edge, and excluding them from the room can have harmful effects, right? It means that they are less well-resourced, less well-networked, less recognized as legitimate representatives of the societies and citizens that they speak for and on behalf of, and the rights that they seek to engage. But of course, it's very difficult to bring civil society into a entity that is fundamentally a multilateral entity that is based on a states-based recognition of membership. And that always is the tension, is do you exclude the states because they may not live up to the level that we'd like to see, but in doing so actually undermine the capacity of civil society to participate effectively? Or do you bring them in and hope that the whole process of engagement is actually a bit of a nudge? I have to say, I think that at this state of where the FOC is, I am also inclined to align with Tatiana that there is a bit more work to do to clarify the next decade of the Freedom Online Coalition's intent, purpose, resourcing. And until that clarification is done, it is very difficult for us to meaningfully contemplate an expansion. Far better for us to engage in ad hoc expansions on specific issues rather than collapse under the weight, as Tatiana said. I love that you described freedom of speech and cybersecurity as complex but simple relative to some of these other issues.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in just to articulate, and I think, Catherine, you did a good job of framing this, but this conversation about the pros and cons of expanding membership to countries specifically has been one that the advisory network, which Tatiana and I sit on, has had on a number of occasions, and I think that the member governments of the FOC have also had on a number of occasions and are going to continue to have. So it's a really good topic for us to pick up on. One thing that I have heard concretely, and not to get into the confidential conversations of the advisory network, but is from advisory network members from countries and regions that are underrepresented, is a desire to be able to get those countries engaged in these conversations so that they can have more opportunities and better ammunition is quite a martial analogy, but better tools to be able to have more meaningful conversations with the governments that they're engaging with in their day-to-day work as advocates for digital rights. And so I think there is probably a series of creative options that we could imagine that that allow for more engagement with these countries that are, on the fence, as Tatiana put it, sometimes, more committed or less, depending on the administration or depending on the internal ministry or agency and the issue that they're grappling with. But without necessarily watering down the organization and bringing in a bunch of countries for which the organization is going to just have to continue to answer difficult questions about, well, how is this organization actually living up to the norm? So, there is an observer mechanism that was created through the Stockholm Terms of Reference about 5 years ago. And as far as I can recall, I don't think there's ever actually been an observer country. So maybe there's something about that criteria for the observer category that was not appropriate, and that needs to be tweaked. But there could be mechanisms like that, and I think maybe we'll talk later about the task force sort of engagement structure that has been a kind of recent innovation, so builds on the early working group model that we've talked about, referred to a couple of times here, that there could be opportunities to bring in states, as well as other sort of government actors who are not states, right? There are regional organizations like the European Commission or the African Union. I mentioned the Council of Europe already, that could have sort of interesting overlaps and relevance.
So what do you think the relationship between the FOC and those kind of regional and supranational? I mean, FOC was like this, traditional multilateral sort of, member, vote sort of country model. Like, what do you think the relationship between the FOC should be with these regional and sort of supranational bodies?
That's a good question. It may have to depend a little bit on the body. So, for example, regional bodies like the European Commission and the African Union, Organization for American States, are both targets for the FOC, right? Those bodies do their own resolutions and have their own processes that relate to internet freedom, and so there might be useful ways for the FOC countries to better coordinate as to how they are participating in those bodies. Not all of the FOC countries obviously participate in those bodies, but enough do in certain ones that there could be targets of opportunity. But then the other sort of direction to engage them is inviting them into conversation with the FOC and saying, hey, Council of Europe, for example, you've got this new additional protocol to the Budapest Convention, Cybercrime Convention, and we as the FOC, there have been concerns that have been articulated about that new convention and some of the kind of some of the authority that it gives to governments as signatories to be able to get access to data from companies in a more expedited and direct manner than would exist without the convention. Maybe the FOC, kind of through its collective engagement and resources and the collective sort of wisdom of the advisory network and stakeholders that it brings in, could partner with the council in terms of, helping to think about ways to implement that protocol, safeguards as you implement those protocols, or kind of bringing those countries that are implementing the protocol into conversations with civil society about how it's working in practice. Those kinds of things I think could be really useful. That takes a lot of capacity. It would require additional resources. But I think there could be some really interesting outcomes if the FOC were to engage in that way.
Yeah, Jason, and you and I have talked in the past also about sort of the FOC as a forum for learning, for all the sort of stakeholders who participate. And I think, the new COE protocol is sort of an interesting example where, you could imagine an FOC sort of facilitated workshop about, that protocol and, what it means and how should member states sort of think about this with input from different stakeholders. Like, I don't know where there's another forum besides sort of ad hoc consultations and trust relationships to do that. That seems like a cool space, cool, value add for the FOC. Tatiana and Catherine, if you have thoughts on just real quick, because I want to make sure we could have this conversation for hours. And I want to make sure we touch on a couple other points, but real quick, any hot takes on how the FOC should engage with these sort of regional and supranational bodies?
If I may, I would like to provide European perspective on this. Please. So I think that we are talking about fundamental values of the Freedom Online Coalition, and here I very much agree with Catherine. Thank you so much, Catherine. For me, the fundamental value here lies not only in human rights, it is actually in global connectivity, in the promise, the technical layer of the internet, protocols, unique identifiers, routing standards, and so on and so forth, but mostly protocol and unique identifiers gives to us. and the model of its governance. And I do think that at this stage, at this moment of time, the European Union is taking a lot of regulatory steps in the name of digital sovereignty, which are targeting specifically this technical layer, which might in the long run break the connectivity. So the engagement with the European Union and some coordination is absolutely necessary here, because its member states are actually members of Freedom Online Coalition. But then the question is, because European Union is layered like an onion, okay, that's a very bad comparison. It is a complex structure, right? The question is whom you engaged with. European Parliament is normally on that side, right? On the side of the Freedom Online Coalition, and they're fighting these regulatory interventions. Perhaps European Commission, perhaps Council, member states. So identification of the right point of engagement would be crucial here. But I absolutely think that engagement is necessary. I do not think that the European Union should become a member or observer of the Freedom Online Coalition just because of the complexity of the structure. But I absolutely think that the engagement should not be ad hoc. The engagement should be ongoing, because otherwise we might come to the point when member states and the European Union are declaring their adherence to these values, but in practice they're just not living by them.
I guess my response
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, is simply not to speak to Europe per se, but more broadly, is that you can't influence fora where you're not in dialogue. And so particularly when we talk about the distinction between the members of the Freedom Online Coalition and those that are outside the proverbial tent, or those that are on the fence, the advantage of these regional bodies is that oftentimes they contain a mix. And so to engage consistently is to create the opportunity to speak to those states that perhaps are on a wide array of issues, may have a variety of different postures depending on what the issue might be, as well as those that are outside the tent that we would like to be able to continue to share our priorities with. And so from my perspective, that broader value proposal is one that makes it worthwhile.
If I can use my moderator's prerogative here, and someone who's been around, sort of FOC since very early, like, I think for the reasons that I think Tatiana and Catherine in particular sort of picked on, I would urge a small tent right now. And really sort of get the FOC to sort of get focused, get reinvigorated, figure out the resourcing and sort of the strategy to really sort of drive action, right? Because if we're not solving real problems in the world, right, if we just get up on our soapbox and we talk about our values, and maybe we talk about our values in different places, right? Like, the value is in the action. The value is in advancing a more just, equitable, rights-respecting world. And I think that's going to be easier to do as you sort of keep things, the official membership, smaller. But I think, as Jason pointed out, you don't really necessarily, like, just focusing on membership is not the only tool in the toolbox. There are a number of structural opportunities to bring in other people, to have sort of dialogue, as Catherine was saying, and partnership that allows you to sort of work. And so I think thinking about, and I would encourage our friends in the US government who are holding this file right now to think about, like, what are those structures that might enable that kind of dialogue and sort of meaningful cooperation between these sort of different entities, without sort of falling into the trap of thinking, is it formal membership or not? And I think it's also about bringing resources to the table to actually support that sort of broader, if we think about concentric circles of democratic alignment, right? Like, I think that there is a group of countries that we do want to influence that are, can be brought more closely, to living and sharing our values. And I think, we should be looking for those strategic opportunities to engage with those countries outside of formal membership, but with the sort of resources to be credible with them. I think let's talk about sort of one of those additional structures just really quick, because I think a lot of folks might not be familiar with the advisory network. And so, Jason, Tatiana, maybe you can say like a little bit of what is the advisory network and how is it functioning? As Catherine noted earlier, the FOC is at its core a multilateral entity, right? That has then, I remember when we sort of very quickly were like, hang on, you all agreed in WSIS that, like, multi-stakeholder, governance of the internet how do we get a seat at the table? And I think, I think the FOC has gone through a couple iterations of what does it mean to sort of engage civil society. What does it currently look like? And, what are some thoughts for sort of the future in terms of what it ought to look like to really meet the needs and interests of civil society?
Yeah, I'm happy to start and just because I was at the State Department and had the FOC portfolio at the time when we went through the work that led into the Stockholm Terms of Reference, which were adopted, I believe, in 2017, which created the advisory, among other things, created the advisory network. So there was a broader process of trying to formalize, for example, for countries, what are the criteria for membership? Is there a process for removing a country? None of that had actually been written down at the beginning. So there was sort of a need as the organization had grown, more established and larger, to kind of formalize things. And so the advisory network was one component of that. And the idea was to allow for non-governmental actors to not just participate on the sort of ad hoc topic-specific conversations as the working groups had been organized, but to really be positioned to give advice to the FOC chair and the friends of the chair, which is the kind of executive committee, if you will, of the larger FOC. So we're sort of into the second 3-year term of that advisory network. Every 3 years, it's meant to sort of be open and different members cycle out, and there's a call for applications for new members to join. The membership is open to anyone who is considered sort of non-state. So there are private sector representatives, there are academics like Tatiana, there are civil society organizations represented. And I think over time, there's also been a real attempt to get more majority world participation, more diversity along a variety of different criteria. So it's a really interesting group, I think, I think kind of the collective expertise and lived experience of that group has been really valuable. It's been very valuable to me as a member, just to be able to learn from the other members of the advisory network. But I think it's also been valuable to the FOC governments to have this sort of sounding board to kind of go, so the way that the relationship is structured, the FOC can formally ask for advice from the advisory network, and the advisory network has a period of time to develop a response. But similarly, the advisory network can offer advice sort of its own without having to be asked. And we've done both of those things a number of times on important topics over the years. And I think that's, by and large, it's been a pretty good relationship. It has its limits. There's a cap to the number of people on the advisory network. So it can't be ever as representative of the really diverse set of interests and expertise and I think relevance that is out there to the FOC's work. But the task forces that I referenced earlier that have kind of sprung up alongside the advisory network, I think have become a useful way to engage a slightly larger group of people. So that's my 2 cents on kind of what it is and what it was designed for. Maybe Tatiana, if you have other thoughts on your experience, based on your experience, or as the incoming chair of the advisory network, feel free to jump in.
Thank you, Jason. Well, your 2 cents feel like rather 10 cents because you explained almost everything. What I wanted to add is only being on the advisory network already for 2.5 terms. This is my last year, and I'm term limited, so very happy to serve as a co-chair in my last year. But I do feel that a lot of communication and interaction between the advisory network and the FOC depends on the chair and on the channels of communication organized by the chairing country. And in the last year, especially felt like these channels were very transparent and very ongoing and very well supported by Canada. And this also boosted the activity of the advisory network as well, because of course you can and let's be honest, this is sort of institutionalized structure, right? Once you have it, it legitimizes your decisions or statements at the Freedom Online Coalition in a way, right? But it doesn't have to be active to legitimize you. But I do feel that this advisory network, with all the help of various chairs through the years, became really active and created its own process and institutions between the members and within itself. And I do think that this is a network which is so rich in expertise. It's really beneficial for the Freedom Online Coalition. And personally, for me, as Jason said, being a part of this network is such a great pleasure and also a learning curve, because I'm learning from the colleagues of this network, and it's really wonderful.
Tatiana, so I think we've long seen a lot of engagement from sort of various flavors of civil society, from nonprofits to academics, some from the technical community and so forth. But industry has been sort of sometimes there, sometimes the very largest companies have a presence. But Catherine, maybe just a quick take from you on sort of what is the role of industry vis-a-vis the FOC, and how should the FOC from a member state perspective be thinking about industry?
Well, I can't speak for all industry. I can speak from my
not all industry.
Hashtag not all industry. I can speak from my own experiences with Wikipedia, and I can speak for what I'd like to see. My feeling is that industry actually should certainly be engaged, should have dedicated points of contact for participation in these fora, should expect a certain degree of skepticism, but engaged nonetheless, right, from the civil society participants, certainly, and sort of accountability and feet to the fire. But I think that the overall take that I have is that industry actually has equities here in ensuring that bodies like the FOC continue to exist. I think the worst possible outcome for industry, whether it realizes it or not, is the degradation of the multi-stakeholder system of internet governance and of rulemaking. And the reason for that is that the more that the existing modalities of how we govern the internet writ large, I don't just mean at the protocol level, I mean all the sorts of conversations that we have around what we'd like to see in terms of normative behaviors and expectations, which often leads to and informs, regulation and policy making in the domestic context, which of course is what the industry is actually accountable to. The more that moves away from a multi-stakeholder process, the more that moves away from happening in multilateral fora, the more that industry will be accountable for participating in bilateral conversations between a company and the host country that it is operating in. And when a company is subject to the jurisdiction of the host country that it is operating in, without the context of the international community backing it up either from a rights-based perspective or balancing the policies against what is considered best practices or best standards, both in terms of a rights-based perspective, but also just in terms of feasibility and the protection of its employees or the protection of its practices, industry is actually at a loss. That is harmful to industry, both in terms of its ability to operate, the actual physical risks that it poses to its users and to its employees and its interests in a country, and in terms of the resources that need to go into managing those relationships, particularly legal resources, because often this ends up in the court of lawyers, the resources necessary to go into managing the concerns and the relationships with government in terms of government relations, but also the sort of potential for litigation that then occurs when a company falls afoul of whatever conditions may exist. And so I think that there is actually a fairly self-serving version of the world in which industry should participate in this. It is beneficial to industry to participate in this type of fora, and it is actually, of course, of value to rights-respecting countries and rights-respecting civil society to engage industry in these fora in order to ensure that industry is more accountable and more aligned with the sort of outcomes that we want to see within the business and human rights framework. And so there's a net benefit to both sides. Of course, there's going to be some degree of accountability and friction that occurs in these areas, but overall, the benefits are so significant relative to the alternative that I couldn't speak more positively for the opportunity to bring industry in, and then for industry, of course, to dedicate the resources necessary to be participating meaningfully and to push their own national governments to participate meaningfully as well. I think that industry plays a role in upholding the commitments of national governments and encouraging them to see the value of maintaining and resourcing these fora effectively in order for them to be successful.
I will be at least the second person today to violently agree with Catherine, but I will say the flip side, having like worked at a company that I made the call to sort of help to downsize our involvement with the FOC when I was at Mozilla, right, is tangible demonstrations of progress, right? Like if we're going to spend time and resources here, like I philosophically absolutely see the role for the FOC and to play those, various, roles then and sort of mechanisms that you laid out, but it's got to actually do it, right? And there has to be that sort of solving real problems, being the people that we can sort of turn to, that is when there is that threat, right, to our users around the world, like we can turn to and say like, hey, let's have a conversation about this. How do we actually make sure these folks are defended?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that this is where fora proliferation is a real risk, right? It's not just civil society that struggles when there are too many fora to participate in. It is also
1,000%.
Industry doesn't struggle per se. It just is going to make choices about where its value actually, the value add actually is, and then it's going to allocate budget and resources accordingly. And so it is incumbent on bodies like the FOC to demonstrate actual value in order to continue to sustain. But then again, I've always been against fora, nonprofit proliferation, all of these things. I do think that when things run out of value, it is also time for graceful degradation. So it is incumbent on the FOC to demonstrate that it has value. It is incumbent on the FOC to participate meaningfully and return rewards to the entities that it serves. But I think that has a lot to do as well with the nation states that are its members. It's incumbent on the chairs to demonstrate that they are actually committed to seeing this through. And by all accounts, it was a relatively successful year under Canadian chairship. And now this is a responsibility that falls to the Americans coming forward. And I think we haven't talked about that much. So I don't know if that's a good segue.
Absolutely. So maybe we'll do one tweet on the Canadians and one tweet on the Americans. And so on the Canadian side, I think Tatiana and Jason would love to hear from you in particular. You've sort of observed the Canadian government up close during their term as chair. Are there any practices the U.S. government should, consider emulating or make sure sort of continue to get support in the year ahead and years ahead?
Yeah. So I think it's actually the Canadians. You have to start by sort of acknowledging that they took over from the Finnish government, which had chaired the year before, and they had, I think, done also a pretty strong job of kind of keeping everything moving, being on top of things, identifying opportunities for the FOC, both internal needs as well as external opportunities. They were, of course, chairing during the heart of COVID, so it was a bit of a strange time, and there is some real value to the kind of getting people together through the FOC conferences and other adjacent spaces that I think that was missed. But I think the Canadians did a great job of picking up on that leadership, and they brought their own sort of elements and approaches. So the Canadian sort of feminist foreign policy that has defined this administration's approach more generally was very evident and I think very useful. And in particular fed in well to the task force on equitable inclusion, which has been something that the advisory network, certain members of the advisory network have led. And so I think they're really leaving the U.S. in a good position in terms of the kind of renewed engagement across a number of different fronts. The U.S. will have, of course, its own approach. Questions about how this ties into the Summit for Democracies, the second summit, which will be happening in March, I believe, how this ties into kind of broader questions that are being raised around the U.S. approach to foreign policy generally, and then specifically to internet governance. So it's going to be an interesting year, but I'm really glad that the U.S. is chairing the FOC at this particular moment.
Jason, that was more than one tweet, but thank you for that rich guidance. Tatiana, in a tweet, because I want to get to our last question.
In a tweet, outreach to other communities, continuity in what has been done and what Canada is doing, engagement with variety stakeholders, especially civil society, and transparency in what they're doing, relative transparency in what they're doing and their next steps and how the decisions are made.
Thank you. And so on that model of a tweet comment, and we started this conversation with you all sharing your sort of visions for what a maximally effective version of the FOC could look like. And to close out our conversation today, would like to ask all of our panelists if there's sort of one thing the U.S. government must or must not do as it steps into the chair role to reinvigorate the FOC and help realize that original vision of the FOC. What would you recommend? Let's go, Catherine first.
Repudiate the vision of a fragmented internet built off cyber sovereignty and speak with commitment, effectiveness, and associated resources to the vision of an open, interoperable, free, and secure internet as instrumental to the sorts of societies, free, open, pluralistic, that we want to live in.
Thank you. Tatiana?
Must not forget that at the core of open, free, interoperable, stable internet is the model of its governance, multi-stakeholder model of its governance. Must not forget that reinforcing this commitment is at the core of Freedom Online Coalition existence.
Yeah, so I will try and be better. So resources, full stop, more resources, and then high-level engagement consistently, not just a single speech by a Secretary of State or an Undersecretary, but really demonstrating consistent and broad engagement. Real opportunity for the new bureau at the State Department to demonstrate how it's coordinating across the interagency.
Absolutely. And I think if you do all those things, the FOC and the world will be in an incredible position. Really, I think this is one of the sort of unsung and underappreciated fora, but that is more necessary than ever before. It's sort of shoring up the foundation of the FOC, ensuring that it is resourced both internally in terms of its governance and operations, but also in terms of what it can offer to member countries, to non-member countries, to strategic partnerships with regional bodies. I think that there is an important role for the FOC to play here, and I'm excited to see what the U.S. does during its term as chair. And I think what you've heard today is that there's a lot of wisdom and support out there for the FOC, and that our friends who are taking over this file are certainly not alone, and have a lot of allies out there. So thank you all for for sharing your wisdom with us today, and for all that you do. And thank you to our hosts at the Atlantic Council for having us for this conversation. And finally, if you like this session, or perhaps especially if you didn't, there is a whole lot more to choose from at 360 StratCom, and a lot of other relevant event information on the official DFRLab website and their social media accounts. Look forward to checking that out, and thank you for all that you do. Be well.
Thank you for all of those shout outs, Yohai. First and foremost, thank you to Deputy Foreign Minister of Canada, David Morrison, and the U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor, Ann Neuberger, for joining us at the top of that session. Again, thank you, Yohai, for your excellent moderation and amplification of everything that's going on here at the DFRLab. And to Jason, Catherine, and Dr. Trapina for that excellent session. I'm very thankful to be able to continue to learn from friends and colleagues like all of you. We now turn to our last session for today. At the DFRLab and Atlantic Council, we believe that a healthier digital future relies on people capable of building and governing technology from every country, background, and perspective. As part of that, we've been focused on building better standards, bigger community, and widening the definition of what a tech workforce means. One of the ways we do that is something called the Digital Sherlocks program, which promotes a growing movement of data-driven research of digital information ecosystems. In other words, promoting a shared set of facts that democracy depends on. With 2 cohorts per year, we've now trained more than 2,500 people from over 130 countries, making it the world's largest free virtual training program dedicated to students, members of civil society, journalists, and academics working to monitor and protect information environments in their respective regions. In addition to the Digital Sherlocks program, Our Cyber Statecraft initiative has run a program called Cyber 912 for nearly a decade. It is the world's only global cyber policy and strategy competition designed to tackle the cyber skills shortage and increase technical and policy literacy through crisis simulation. Cyber 912 convenes student teams from a range of academic disciplines to respond to realistic cyber crises with expert judges drawn from government, industry, and civil society. Over 40% of Cyber 912 competitors are computer science or IT students seeking to hone their communication skills and understanding of cyber policy implications. So we couldn't be more excited to close out today with someone focused on what a cyber and tech workforce means from a government perspective. Camille Stewart-Gloucester leads the Biden administration's efforts to strengthen the national tech workforce and efforts to build a resilient digital ecosystem. She'll be introduced during the session, but I'd be remiss if I didn't say that Camille has been an incredible leader, colleague, and friend. It's my pleasure to turn over to my colleague Safa Sawan Edwards, who leads our Cyber 912 program and will also lead this conversation.
Camille is a cyber, technology, and national security strategist and policy leader whose career has spanned the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. She has held roles in Google, the Department of Homeland Security, Deloitte and The Hill, and much more. She has also held cybersecurity fellowships at the Harvard Belfer Center, New America, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us, Camille.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So much of what underpins this conversation today is about the work that remains to be done by government, industry, and civil society to demystify technology and digital challenges. This way, we can more effectively broaden and understand and invest in the American tech workforce. So if you wouldn't mind answering first, tell us a little bit about ONCD, the Office of the National Cyber Director. What is your office's role and responsibilities, and how does it elevate U.S. tech leadership and capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Office of the National Cyber Director is focused on moving us towards an affirmative vision of a thriving digital ecosystem that is secure, equitable, and resilient that we all can share in. Cybersecurity is a tool to do that, but not the only tool. So ONCD gets to look across the national security implications, the economic implications, and the human rights implications of technology use and promulgation. And our priority areas are focusing on federal coherence. How do we mobilize the federal apparatus to best leverage the authorities and roles and responsibilities across the federal government? National coherence through public-private partnerships and our international partners, et cetera. Aligning resources to aspirations. We're trying to get rid of unfunded mandates. How do we get the money to back up the work that we say that we need to do? And then present and future resilience. And I like to say that my team is focused on that future resilience piece. How do we use the lessons from today to inform the technology and the work of tomorrow? If you think of cyberspace as people, technology, and doctrine is in roles and responsibilities, policy, all of that, then we get to focus on future-proofing the people and the technology, leveraging that doctrine to achieve that affirmative vision that we talked about. So lots of work going on, lots of fun ahead, but workforce is a key component of that. When I talk about people, it's not just people from a human capital perspective, it is how technology shows up in our lives. The fact that people create, promulgate, use, and are the malicious actors that weaponize or leverage technology, that means that we have to understand them as people. That means the broadest cross-section of skills and backgrounds creates a better understanding of the societal context, the cultural context, and all the other things about us as people that informs technology and how it shows up in the world. And so having a highly skilled, multidisciplinary, and diverse workforce is a big component to having that level of understanding. And that's why we push for a strong cyber workforce initiative.
I'm so happy that you mentioned the people component, because something we've always talked about is how can we better protect technology if we don't understand the exact users of technology, both, you know, the average users, but also those malicious actors as well, which brings me to my next question. what lessons have we learned in the recent years about our efforts in workforce development and in this space?
So many lessons. I mean, the biggest one is this is a shared problem across the public sector and the private sector. So the strategy, we are endeavoring to write a cyber workforce education and digital safety awareness strategy. That is a mouthful, but it is to cover all of those things. We want to talk about the challenges in the federal workforce, the challenges across the national workforce, how those interplay with each other, how an education and training apparatus that is robust and thoughtful and isn't limited to just four-year institutions, but leverages also four-year institutions to educate and train our workforce is really important. And then also, how do we think about digital safety awareness so that we raise the collective level of cyber awareness across everyone? That creates opportunity for everyone, but also it contributes to our security. While much of our conversation should be around how do we move the burden of security back to those best equipped, cybersecurity professionals and those in adjacent fields that have the awareness and the knowledge to combat the threats and capitalize on the opportunities, we also need to raise the collective level of understanding so that we move our society in a direction where we've got the workforce to meet the 700,000 open cybersecurity roles, but also such that we have a populace that gets how technology changes their lives every day, how it changes the nature of privacy and security and all of the things that we hold dear.
That's awesome. And I think that like the Biden-Harris administration has spent a lot of time and effort focusing on workforce, which honestly for our team over here at the Atlantic Council is so refreshing. How do you think that this emphasis on workforce development help us better bridge the tech policy divide? What do you think that this means for impacting poor policy?
I think a more comprehensive understanding of the work available in this space will lead to better outcomes. To your point, the broad cross-section of understanding national security jobs, what those are inside of that, all of those things is really important. But tech roles, technology itself underpins anything and everything we are going to do. And so understanding how that interplays in these spaces that we have identified need for an evolving workforce means that there's more opportunity for everyone, means that we are putting our national security first, we're putting our domestic security first, and we have the opportunity to capitalize on the opportunities. One of the things that's really important for ONCD as we have these conversations about technology and how the digital ecosystem evolves is thinking not only about the threat landscape, but what are the opportunities inherent in technology. There is a reason that we started to create all of these cool things to make life more convenient or to scale and to underpin the lives that we live. So how do we do that in a way that considers all of those factors, all of the people, technology, and doctrine factors to best leverage that in addition to making sure that we're as secure as we can be?
And have you seen the past few months that ONCD has since it's been established? How do you see the White House planning to engage with the public sector and the private sector, as well as civil society on these different challenges?
Yes, one of the things that our director, Chris Inglis, charged me with was to make sure that this was a whole of society strategy. And we are doing just that. We have been very thoughtful and intentional about how do we engage industry, academia, our civil society counterparts, our international partners, and folks who are using technology every day to inform their strategy development. Especially with the broad array of issues that we plan to tackle, we cannot do this alone. Like I said, it's a shared challenge space and a shared opportunity space. So how do we have holistic conversations? So we kicked off our effort with a cyber workforce summit in July, where we brought in a bunch of industry and academia and our state and local partners to talk about what we needed from our cyber workforce and to catalyze this strategy effort. We've since released an RFI where we were trying to get the broadest cross-section of folks to interject their lessons learned, the challenges they're seeing, the opportunities they're seeing, the programs that work into our body of knowledge that will inform the strategy. And we got 146 responses. I'm so proud of that engagement because some of those reflect rolled up insights that folks contributed as an industry association. And so that reach is even broader than just 146. And then we've also been having a number of engagements with universities. We went to Hampton University earlier this year and had a conversation with them and their students and their staff about the work that we can do to engage student populations and to leverage universities as part of an ecosystem driver. And then we're going to WATCOM this week, actually. That's why I'm not here in person, but we are going to have a conversation about how does a community college sit at the intersection of regional cyber awareness, regional technology awareness, and how does that catalyze and support the work that's going on a local or regional level? So we're trying to be very thoughtful about the ways we engage and create a number of opportunities to plug into this process.
And it's really helpful to understand how you all have made a concerted effort to engage like civil society and academic institutions. On the other end of the spectrum, how do you see ONCD collaborating with the tech community and building that, while also building that capacity, at the same time trying to make an effort to increase the diversity of contributors in this space?
Yeah, so the most fun thing about my portfolio is I both have cyber workforce education and training and emerging tech, supply chain, the intersection of human rights and technology, privacy, all of the future-looking pieces of the technology landscape. That allows for some very interesting and frankly, forward-looking collaboration that can inform that work. So not only are writing the strategy, but it's informed by things like quantum, like Web3, space, and how we're thinking about what security needs to look like as those things change what the internet looks like today. And so that is a way to engage the technology community, but we're not stopping there. We don't want to engage the same players exclusively. Yes, the big players must be a part of the conversation, but we want to make sure civil society, academia, the small players, the innovators, what the internet, what technology looks like tomorrow is informed by the person who has an idea, creates a thing, and creates a business, or is an innovator within their organization. And we want to make sure that they are a well-integrated part of the conversation. How does venture capital play into that? How does philanthropy play into that? So we want to have a more holistic and fulsome conversation. And so having those two sides of the portfolio really allows for a broader conversation on those things. And as we take on initiatives on the technology security side of the portfolio, we also will pull that into what does this line of effort mean for our education and training aspirations? What does it mean for our digital safety awareness aspirations? And is this a place to have a conversation that engages more people? I mean, if we're having a conversation about quantum, there's a class of people who want to understand what that means for their lives in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's a great awareness building opportunity. Same thing for crypto and Web3. There are a lot of opportunities to engage in a meaningful conversation. And, you know, how do we move conversations that are happening today, like open source, to Web3? How do we make sure that we're thinking about it in that context? And so the technology community will be highly integrated on both sides of the portfolio, and that coming together under the technology and ecosystem umbrella really allows for a lot of collaboration and cross-pollination.
I like how you mentioned that, essentially that through line of individuals when they are students or when they are innovators at these different companies, and figuring out what that through line is and how do you engage them regardless of where they are on that path. Which reminds me of how, like, you've had this very impressive career in both, you know, in and out of government. This is a little bit more about your through line. What have your last few years in the private sector and the launch of hashtag Share the Mic in Cyber, how has this approach informed your approach to this current role and moment?
Yeah, so the nice thing about my work at Google was I was very connected to the individual user. All of our work kind of stemmed back to how does this show up for a user? How are we thinking about protecting them? Yes, their enterprise clients and others as well, but like really down to the user. And that mindset coupled with Share the Mic in Cyber, which was an initiative to give voice to Black cyber professionals in the industry and leverage that kind of platform sharing that can happen when allies create space and create opportunities to engage a new audience, to catalyze action and catalyze effort. So a lot of folks felt really limited or hamstrung or inequipped to have a conversation, a meaningful conversation about diversity and systemic inequity and how they could play a role in that. They felt like it was an organizational challenge or an industry challenge or a government challenge. And to an extent it is. but there is a lot of opportunity to catalyze collective action through individual action. An individual manager, an individual employee can start a conversation, can create space for their peers across a number of different diverse attributes that open up the industry in a way that drives towards a more collective and meaningful action. And that's what we saw on Share the Mic in Cyber. So taking the observation, the realization that individual action can really catalyze something big, and coupling that with that focus on the individual and understanding that in technology, you really do have to individualize the narrative for it to resonate with people. Those things are really informing the work that we're doing in technology and ecosystem security and ONCD writ large.
It's crazy how when we talk about systemic inequity, a lot of people maybe feel a little hamstrung, or they're not really sure how to move forward because it can be such a daunting task to take on. When in reality, it's just moving forward is just taking little baby steps and little itty bitty actions that make a huge difference for our entire community. And I think speaking of like small actions or small things that we can move forward, is what is one partnership or policy action that you think could have an outsized impact on our ability to foster a technically literate workforce?
Ooh, a tech literate workforce is really key. Honestly, I want everyone to feel ownership of the strategy that's going to come out. And so our goal in doing this work is to think about how we draft a strategy that connects to every stakeholder so that you feel a call to action. Your call to action is clear, it is well articulated, and we can incentivize that call to action that we give you in a way that pushes you or drags you along if your peers are leading to do this work, because quite frankly, the market is changing, technology is not going anywhere, so we all need to understand it. And so as we think about how technology underpins each of our lives every day, and we keep having that conversation, that needs to translate to how you think about work and life and how that moves through that. And actually, work and technology moving through your work is actually a great way to get people to think about technology broadly, right? How it changes their privacy, how it changes their security, how it changes their lives, the trade-offs they're making. And so I don't know that I could call out any one group, but I think the thing that will make this different and is essential to its success is every stakeholder group feeling some connection, because it really, really will take industry, academia, state, local, tribal, international, individual, like everybody's partnership, education, institutions, training, delivers. I mean, it really will take everyone to see this through. And so I think that's actually what makes this very unique, is you cannot look at one place on the cyber workforce life cycle or the tech workforce life cycle. We often see initiatives that focus on pipeline or focus on senior leadership. And truthfully, to make meaningful progress, you have to focus on the entire life cycle, because new entrants see middle and senior folks that look like them thriving in the industry, and that drives them to do more work. Broader conversations about technology and cyber means there's more opportunity for more communities because they're aware of it. And there's just this feeding funnel that happens. And so I don't know that I could pick one group. I just need to go find all of you and get you again.
I like how you talk about that though, because it's we always talk about a talent pipeline, when in reality it's more like a flywheel or like a pinwheel, where it's a continuous cycle of engaging people at different stages in their career. Every single organization or person is engaging with a different part of that community or part of that cycle, and that's okay. But it's just a matter of trying to extend that so that we're better reinforcing one another's efforts.
Exactly.
So your team just wrapped up a sprint on apprenticeships recently. Are there any insights that you can share with us on that recent sprint and lessons learned?
I'm so glad you brought that up. So as part of the Cyber Workforce Summit, we launched in partnership with Department of Labor and Department of Commerce a 120-day cybersecurity apprenticeship sprint. That is an important tool to getting diverse participants into the cybersecurity industry. And we're seeing a lot of pickup on apprenticeships, bringing new voices, new communities into different careers. And so having one focus on the cybersecurity space was really important. we saw over 7,000 apprentices getting hired, over 1,000 of whom were from the private sector. 42% were people of color and 32% female of those private sector apprentices. That's huge. Prior to the sprint, 27% of all cybersecurity apprentices were people of color and 28% women. So it really reflects the impact that this sprint can have and how public-private partnerships working together to really drive community-based organizations to engage diverse populations can help us in achieving our desired outcomes. Over 2,000 organizations and career seekers expressed interest in learning more about registered apprenticeships. So the work doesn't stop here. DoD endeavored to build the biggest apprenticeship program of all of our participants. And so what we've seen out of DoD is huge. And I think there'll be a lot more work for folks to get into the Department of Defense through apprenticeships. And so we're really just heartened to see how engaged our private sector partners have been in this initial launch, how much opportunity there is through apprenticeships. And it's a great tool. It should not be the only tool by any stretch of the imagination. As you can hear from our strategy, we recognize that this has to be a multifaceted engagement model, and you'll need to leverage a multitude of different tools. But apprenticeships has shown itself to be a really strong one for engaging diverse communities and for bridging that training gap that we've seen, right? So much of the conversation around tech and cyber roles is that we want folks to have security clearances and certifications that have requirements well beyond entry-level years of experience. You need 5 years of experience to get a CISSP, and that's an entry-level requirement. That's not feasible for anyone entering into the market. And so apprenticeships is a great way to help reorient the market to understand what their needs really are based on skill set and move us more towards skills-based hiring. So we're excited by the results and the engagement and the interest in apprenticeships, and we anticipate seeing a lot more of that as we continue to move towards an actual strategy and then how we implement that. The other thing that I'll say that's related, because I mentioned implementation, but is not directly related to apprenticeships, is in the strategy development effort, a big part of what we want to do is focus on having a strong implementation mechanism. So often you see great initiatives fall because there is no apparatus for accountability, for driving it forward so that it outlives whoever is sitting in the seat. And that'll be a key piece of this work, is figuring out what an appropriate and long-term implementation model is, such that this work continues on as things evolve.
I'm so happy you explained this some more, because it's something we talked about while I work with mostly with post-secondary students in academic institutions. That's not the only way to start a career in cybersecurity. And it's so exciting to see the attention and resources being devoted to trying to ensure that we meet talent where they are, and that we try to figure out where we can fit them into that pipeline to get them into these critical roles. But like you mentioned earlier, you have a really fun job where you are dual-hatted in a way, where you handle a lot of the tech ecosystem work, but also the workforce development. On the other side of the house, on the tech and security side, what's going on there? What are some exciting things coming down the pipe?
Yeah, so we are on the cusp of a lot of really cool things. My first few months have been focused on hiring. I need smart people in seats to do this work. We've had some great hires recently, and so I'm excited to really dive into the fullness of some of the work that is in our plate. We will be focused on the intersection of space and cybersecurity. We have an open source software security initiative that we began earlier this year, that the first phase of it is wrapping up. We were really focused on what is the federal government's role in helping drive open source software security. And now that we've kind of gotten a lay of the land and the opportunities present for the federal government, how do we also continue to drive that forward? And from our perspective, really future-proof that conversation. How do we make sure that we're having the conversation in contexts that matter? I think earlier I mentioned, how do we think about open source software security in the context of Web3? How do we think about the evolution of that, right? Web3 is going to continue to be designed by this collective contribution model that is open source. And so are we thinking about that proactively? We'll be working on climate and EVs and the security implications there. We'll be working on quantum. There's lots of work there. A quantum internet means a lot of great threats and opportunities. So what are we doing to make sure that we're prepared and that we're leveraging all of the opportunities inherent in what quantum computing can do for how we predict vaccines and predict threat models and all of these things. There's a lot of good work that could come out of that. So how do we both prepare for the threats and the opportunities?
I have so many more questions about all the cool work that ONCD has underway, but we are coming up on time here. And I'd like to ask one last question. So earlier today, we had a panel on the Freedom Online Coalition. Can you tell us a little bit about the connections between your work and these conversations on how democracies can collaborate globally to keep the internet free, open, secure, and interoperable in the face of mounting threats?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier that thinking about equity and human rights issues in the context of technology is a priority for us as well. And Freedom Online Coalition is a great tool and vehicle to do that, to collaborate with our partners, to really think about what democracy looks like now and in the future and how technology underpins that. I attended the meetings on the margins of the G7 to talk about that very thing. And one of the things that we're seeing is there's a real need for that federal coherence to then inform that international dialogue. The ONCD will really be thinking about and driving how we all come together as a federal ecosystem, bring in the private sector perspectives to inform that work on democracy in the context of the internet and technology and how it'll evolve over time. So there will definitely be work in partnership with State Department and other interagency partners to think about what are the national security implications, the economic implications, and the human rights implications that it should inform democracy in the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much again, Camille, for joining us today, and especially for lending your expertise and insights at this year's 360 StratCom.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to the next opportunity to engage.
Thank you, Safa and Camille, for that excellent panel. And thank you to all of you so much for spending time with us today. We've covered a lot of ground, and I hope you found the conversations engaging and educational.
Well, you see Rose and I here on the screen. We want to take a moment to recognize the entire team at DFRLab and the Atlantic Council that put this convening together. And we wouldn't have been able to do it without them. So we're going to close out for today. We cannot thank you enough for everything that you've done and spending a little time with us this morning.
And I guess I'd be remiss with us as a team named the Digital Forensic Research Lab, not to call out that we hope that you will continue to engage with the content. Any sessions that you missed can be found on our website, as well as every single 360 StratCom that we've ever done on our YouTube channel. You can find us, obviously, through all of the social media platforms that we use on the handle @DFRLab. And we hope that you'll continue to these conversations that we started today online and in person. Very much look forward to doing this again.
As we say, thank you for everything that you do, and we'll see you on the internet.